What if everything we thought we knew about the ancient world was just a fraction of the story? Picture this: long before satellites, maps, or even written language, our ancestors journeyed across the globe, guided not by chance, but by hidden pathways woven into the very fabric of the earth. These were not just trails or rivers. They were vast, secret corridors, natural masterpieces of geography and climate that connected continents and made possible the spread of humanity itself. For thousands of years, these routes remained buried not just under soil and sea, but under layers of mystery, waiting for us to uncover their stories. Today, we're setting out on a journey to explore 29 of these incredible prehistoric corridors that silently shaped the destiny of our species. Imagine a time when you could walk from Asia to North America on solid ground, or sail a rich coastal highway fringed with kelp forests, bursting with life. Envision a green Sahara, crisscrossed with rivers and alive with communities, or a frozen Siberian steppe where mammoths roamed and humans followed. These were real places, vital passageways that allowed ideas, cultures, and people to flow between landmasses we now see as separate and distant. They facilitated some of history's most pivotal migrations, enabled the exchange of technology and belief, and laid the groundwork for civilizations that would eventually span the globe. Yet as sea levels rose, climates shifted, and deserts expanded, these corridors vanished, hidden in plain sight, their secrets preserved only in fragments of bone, stone, and story. This video is your invitation to travel back in time and trace these forgotten pathways. We'll venture from the frozen bridge between continents known as Beringia to the submerged green plains of the Persian Gulf, from the maritime routes of the Indian Ocean to the spiritual songlines of Australia. Together, we'll explore how these corridors originated, why they disappeared, and what they tell us about human courage, adaptability, and connection. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a rediscovery of the hidden networks that made us who we are. So settle in, open your mind, and get ready to see the ancient world in a whole new light. So what exactly were these prehistoric corridors? Think of them as nature's own superhighways, carved not by human hands but by the immense forces of climate and geology over thousands of years. They weren't paved or marked on any map. Instead, they were land bridges that emerged from the sea when ocean levels dropped, vast river valleys that cut through continents, and sheltered coastlines that offered a safe passage for journeying families. During the last great ice age, so much water was locked up in massive glaciers that the world's oceans were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. This dramatically reshaped the coastlines of every continent, revealing hidden pathways that had been submerged for millennia. A determined group, following herds of animals or searching for new resources, could literally walk from one continent to another. These routes became the invisible scaffolding for the greatest story ever told, the global migration of our species. But these corridors were more than just physical routes. They were engines of change. They didn't just allow people to move, they facilitated the flow of everything that makes us human. A new method for crafting a stone tool could travel thousands of miles along these networks. A spiritual belief or a stylistic art form could be shared between cultures that never actually met, passed from one group to the next through trade and interaction at key crossroads. The exchange of genetic material between populations prevented isolation and spurred adaptation. These secret pathways were the internet of the ancient world, a slow but incredibly powerful web of connection that allowed knowledge and innovation to diffuse across staggering distances. They ensured that a breakthrough in one part of the world didn't have to be independently rediscovered everywhere else. For the longest time, the existence of these vast networks remained one of Earth's best-kept secrets. They were hidden in two ways. First, by geography itself, a mountain pass known only to local tribes, or a lush river valley that was the sole route through an otherwise impassable desert. And second, they were concealed by time. As the climate warmed and the ice sheets retreated, rising seas swallowed coastal routes and drowned entire landscapes. Lush green corridors slowly turned to dust and sand, while forests reclaimed valleys. The evidence of these passageways and the people who used them was buried under layers of sediment, water, and myth. It's only through the dedicated work of modern science, from archaeologists carefully excavating ancient campsites to geologists analyzing seabed cores and geneticists tracing lineage through DNA, that we are now able to redraw these forgotten maps and finally see the connected world our ancestors knew. Now, to truly grasp how these hidden pathways came to be, we need to understand the two great architects behind them: the planet's ever-shifting climate and its powerful geological forces. Imagine Earth's climate as a massive, slow-breathing entity. During the ice ages, this entity would take a deep breath in, locking away enormous volumes of water in vast continental glaciers that were miles thick. This exhale of ice caused global sea levels to plummet, sometimes by over 400 feet compared to today. That's like draining away the water from a 40-story building. This single climatic phenomenon didn't just change coastlines. It completely reorganized the world map, pulling back the ocean's curtain to reveal sprawling continental shelves that became dry land. The most famous of these, the Bering land bridge, was a gateway continent in its own right, nearly 1,000 miles wide from north to south, connecting Asia and North America. But it wasn't alone. All around the world, new territories emerged from the sea, offering solid ground where there had once been only ocean trenches. While climate was lowering the seas, geology was busy reshaping the land itself. Tectonic plates, those colossal slabs of Earth's crust, are in constant, slow motion. Their collisions push up mountain ranges, creating new barriers, but they also forge new pathways in the process. River valleys would deepen and shift course, carving natural highways through rugged terrain. In other places, volcanic activity could be just as influential. A massive eruption might block an ancient route with layers of ash and lava, effectively sealing it off for centuries. But conversely, that same volcanic activity could create incredibly fertile soil, attracting game animals and, in turn, human hunters who would establish new trails through the recovering landscape. These geological processes didn't just create the corridors, they also acted as their custodians. A landslide might bury a campsite under tons of rock, tragically for the people there, but that same event would perfectly preserve that site for archaeologists to discover millennia later, freezing a moment in time. The real magic happened in the interplay between these two forces. A period of glacial retreat wouldn't just melt ice, it would open up entirely new passes through mountain ranges that were previously sealed by impassable ice sheets. As these glaciers receded, they would leave behind softened landscapes of meltwater lakes and freshly scoured valleys, creating inviting routes for exploration. Meanwhile, in a place like the Sahara, a shift in the Earth's orbital pattern could trigger a humid period, transforming a deadly desert into a network of green, lush corridors dotted with lakes and rivers, connecting communities that were once worlds apart. This dynamic relationship between the sky and the stone reminds us that our planet is not a static stage upon which human history unfolded. It is a deeply dynamic and participatory character in the story. Our ancestors' greatest journeys were made possible by these temporary windows of opportunity, geological moments of calm and climatic golden hours that opened up, allowed humanity to pass through, and then closed again, often for the final time, keeping their secrets safe until we were ready to listen. Of all the ancient superhighways that once crisscrossed our planet, few capture the imagination quite like the Bering Land Bridge. Picture this immense landscape, not as a narrow strip of land, but as a sprawling subcontinent itself, nearly 1,000 miles wide from north to south. During the peak of the last ice age, with so much of the world's water locked away in massive glaciers, sea levels dropped dramatically, exposing a vast plain known as Beringia that connected what is now Siberia and Alaska. This wasn't a temporary landfall. It persisted for thousands of years, forming a solid, frozen gateway between two worlds. For generations, the very existence of this bridge was a theoretical concept, a necessary explanation for how people could have reached the Americas. But today, thanks to incredible advances in geology and archaeology, we understand that Beringia was far more than just a barren, icy passage. It was a dynamic and living landscape, a refugia that teemed with life and provided the resources necessary to sustain ancient travelers on their epic journey. The traditional image of desperate bands of hunters scurrying across a windswept, frozen desert is rapidly being replaced by a much richer story. Core samples taken from the seabed in the Bering Strait have revealed evidence of a landscape that was surprisingly verdant. While glaciers covered much of the land to the east and west, Beringia itself remained largely ice-free due to dry climatic conditions, creating a unique ecosystem of grasslands known as the Mammoth Steppe. This environment supported a remarkable array of megafauna: giant woolly mammoths, steppe bison, muskoxen, and even the formidable short-faced bear. Where there are prey animals, predators and scavengers follow, and humans were the ultimate opportunists. These early explorers weren't just passing through a wasteland. They were moving into a productive hunting ground, following the herds that provided them with food, clothing, tools, and shelter. They likely established seasonal camps, perhaps even lingering for generations in this fertile crossroads, adapting their technologies and cultures to a new way of life before eventually moving deeper into the continents. This revised understanding of Beringia as a habitable world, not just a corridor, fundamentally challenges long-held theories about the peopling of the Americas. The old model suggested a rapid, single-wave migration along an ice-free corridor that opened up in modern-day Canada around 13,000 years ago. But if Beringia was a place where people could live and thrive for extended periods, the timeline and the routes become far more complex and fascinating. Genetic studies suggest populations may have been isolated in this Beringian refugium for thousands of years, a period long enough for them to develop unique genetic signatures before eventually spreading south. This concept, often called the Beringian Standstill hypothesis, paints a picture of a patient, resilient population waiting for the right environmental conditions, whether the retreat of inland ice sheets or the development of coastal routes, to continue their expansion. It transforms the narrative from a desperate sprint into a new world to a strategic, millennia-long period of adaptation and exploration. Every new discovery in this region adds another layer to this incredible story. Archaeological evidence, though scarce because so much of the land bridge is now submerged under the chilly waters of the Bering Sea, is slowly being pieced together. On the islands of Siberia and Alaska, scientists have found evidence of ancient settlements and sophisticated toolkits that hint at a deep familiarity with this environment. The recent discovery of human footprints in New Mexico dating back 23,000 years further ignites debate. suggesting an earlier presence in the Americas than previously thought, and placing an even greater importance on the Bering Land Bridge as the most likely route for that first arrival. Each piece of evidence, from a speck of pollen in a sediment core to a carefully crafted stone spear point, brings us closer to understanding the courage and adaptability of those first people who looked out across that vast plain and decided to walk into the unknown, ultimately setting the stage for the human story across two entire continents. While the story of Beringia unfolds in the frozen north, a completely different prehistoric drama was taking place in the warm, tropical waters of Southeast Asia and Oceania. Here, the rules of geography were rewritten not by ice but by its absence. During the glacial periods, the immense weight of ice sheets locked away vast quantities of seawater, causing sea levels to plummet by over 120 meters. This dramatic drop did not just inch coastlines forward, it revealed entire continents that are now lost beneath the waves. The most significant of these vanished worlds was Sundaland, a colossal peninsula that seamlessly connected the islands of Sumatra, Java, and Borneo directly to the mainland of Southeast Asia. What we see on a map today as scattered islands was, for tens of thousands of years, a single, continuous landmass nearly the size of continental Europe, a lush and inviting landscape of rainforests, river systems, and open savannas. This exposed continental shelf created a superhighway for early human migration. Species like Homo erectus had ventured into this region over 1 million years ago, but it was our own species, Homo sapiens, who ultimately made the great push south and east. They would have found Sundaland to be a land of incredible biodiversity and resources, a place where they could thrive and expand. But the ultimate destination for some of these groups lay even further ahead, across a narrow but significant marine barrier. Even at the lowest sea levels, a deep water channel known as the Wallace Line always separated Sundaland from another vast, exposed landmass to the east, the Sahul Shelf. This was the combined prehistoric continent that joined together what we now call Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania into one gigantic island continent. To reach it, those first pioneering groups had to make a conscious decision to cross open water, a feat that speaks volumes about their ingenuity and seafaring capabilities. The journey to Sahul stands as one of the earliest and most incredible voyages in human history. We are not talking about a simple raft drifting aimlessly with the current. The evidence suggests a purposeful, organized water crossing. To make the trip from the eastern edge of Sundaland to the shores of Sahul, even at the lowest sea levels, required crossing a minimum of 90 kilometers of open ocean. This was not a journey that could be seen from one shore to the other. It demanded planning, the construction of seaworthy watercraft, and a sophisticated understanding of navigation, likely using stars, bird flight paths, and ocean currents. The fact that they succeeded, arriving on the shores of a completely new world with its unique and bizarre megafauna like giant wombats and marsupial lions, represents a monumental leap in human exploration. This was not a slow, land-based migration. It was a deliberate, technologically assisted colonization of a new continent, occurring an astonishing 65,000 years ago, long before humans reached the Americas. The communities that established themselves across Sahul developed in profound isolation, crafting some of the most unique and enduring cultures on Earth. As the world warmed and the Great Melt began, the seas began their relentless rise, forever altering the map. The low-lying plains of Sundaland were gradually inundated, slowly drowning the land bridge back to Asia and transforming its peaks into the islands of Indonesia. The connection between New Guinea and Australia was severed by the flooding of the Torres Strait, and Tasmania became an isolated island off the southern coast. This rising water didn't just change geography, It trapped the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and the indigenous populations of New Guinea and the islands, sealing them off from the rest of the world for thousands of years. This long isolation is etched into their DNA and cultural records, creating the oldest continuous cultures on the planet, whose oral histories and dreamtime stories sometimes contain echoes of these ancient geological events, tales of when the land was different and the water rose. Today, the secrets of these sunken corridors are slowly being recovered from the depths. Archaeologists are turning into underwater detectives, using advanced technologies like sonar mapping and core sampling to reconstruct the lost landscapes of Sundaland and the ancient coastlines of Sahul. They have discovered drowned river valleys, evidence of freshwater sources, and even stone tools on the seabed, confirming human habitation on lands that are now submerged. Each discovery is a piece of a gigantic puzzle, helping us understand the routes those first explorers took and how they adapted to a world that was constantly changing around them. The story of Sundaland and Sahul is ultimately a story of human resilience in the face of cataclysmic environmental change, a testament to our ancestors' ability to not just survive, but to navigate and conquer entirely new worlds, only to see those very worlds vanish forever beneath the sea. While the great continental bridges like Beringia captured vast territories, other corridors were forged in the planet's most unforgiving margins, far to the north, along the treacherous and ice-choked coastlines of the Arctic Ocean. Another secret pathway silently facilitated one of the most remarkable cultural expansions in human history. This was the Thule route, a maritime corridor of incredible hardship and beauty that snaked its way from Siberia across the northern edge of Alaska and eventually into the Canadian Arctic and Greenland. Unlike the grassy plains of Beringia, this was a world of stark contrasts of 24-hour summer sun and endless winter darkness, of shifting sea ice and fiercely cold waters. It was along this formidable coastline that the ancestors of the modern Inuit, a culture known as the Thule people, embarked on a journey that would see them master an environment that few others could even survive. What sets the Thule migration apart is its breathtaking speed and the sophisticated technological package that made it possible. Beginning around 1,000 years ago, these innovators did not merely wander, they traveled with purpose and they moved fast. Archaeological evidence suggests they spread from their origins in Alaska all the way to Greenland in a matter of just a few centuries. This rapid expansion was powered by a revolutionary suite of tools perfectly adapted to the Arctic. Their most vital invention was the large, open-skin boat known as the umiak, capable of transporting entire families, their dogs, and all their possessions across open leads of water between ice floes. For hunting, they used the nimble and nearly silent kayak, allowing them to stealthily approach seals, walrus, and even whales. On land, their dog sleds, with complex harness systems and runners crafted from bone or frozen fish, turned the icy landscape into a highway. This wasn't just movement, it was a calculated migration enabled by some of the most advanced transportation technology of the ancient world. This icy corridor was far from a barren wasteland. It was a rich, if dangerous, ecosystem, and the Thule people knew how to harness its resources. They followed the migrations of bowhead whales, colossal mammals whose sheer size provided a staggering caloric payoff. A single successful hunt could feed a community for months. They developed specialized harpoons with detachable heads and sealskin floats to secure these massive creatures. Their semi-subterranean winter houses, expertly engineered from stone, whalebone, and sod, provided insulation against the bitter cold. The exchange of ideas along this route was constant and vital. A new and more effective sled design developed in one region could spread quickly to the next, as could improvements in clothing like the finely tailored parka made from caribou skin, which created microclimates of warmth. This network of knowledge transformed the entire Arctic into a connected community of shared innovation. The very harshness of the Arctic environment that the Thule people conquered is what has given us such an incredible window into their world. The perpetual cold acts as a deep freezer, preserving organic materials that would have decayed anywhere else on Earth. Archaeologists have discovered perfectly preserved wooden mask fragments, intricate carvings, clothing made from bird skins, and even remnants of food, offering an intimate glimpse into their daily lives and spiritual beliefs. This exceptional preservation allows us to understand not just how they survived, but how they thrived, building a rich cultural life filled with art, storytelling, and complex social structures in one of the most challenging environments on the planet. Their story is a powerful testament to human resilience, showing that a corridor does not need to be green or welcoming to become a cradle of civilization. It simply needs to be navigated by those with the courage and ingenuity to learn its secrets. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most contentious and fascinating ideas in all of archaeology, the Solutrean Hypothesis. This theory dares to suggest a radical rewrite of the earliest chapters of human history in the Americas. It proposes that long before the ancestors of Native Americans crossed the Bering land bridge, a different group of people made an astonishing journey. They were the Solutreans, a sophisticated Paleolithic culture from what is now southwestern Europe, famous for their exquisitely crafted, laurel leaf-shaped stone spear points. The hypothesis suggests that these Ice Age Europeans did not simply stay put. Instead, they are said to have embarked on an epic voyage across the North Atlantic, skirting along the edge of a vast ice shelf that connected their world to a new one, eventually arriving on the eastern shores of North America. This would mean that the first human feet to tread on the soil of the continent may not have come from the west, but from the east, in a story of survival and seafaring that would predate the Bering migration by thousands of years. The core of this controversial argument rests on a compelling side-by-side comparison of stone tool technology. Proponents of the hypothesis point to the uncanny resemblance between the distinctive projectile points made by the Solutreans in Europe between 22,000 and 17,000 years ago, and those made much later by the Clovis culture in North America, which appear around 13,000 years ago. Both cultures produced finely pressure-flaked bifacial points that are incredibly thin, sharp, and aesthetically similar. To some archaeologists, this similarity is too striking to be a coincidence. They argue that it represents a direct transfer of knowledge and technique, suggesting that Solutrean explorers or their descendants were the teachers who inspired the Clovis tradition, effectively making Clovis technology a new world extension of a much older European one. This would shatter the long-held model of the Bering Strait being the sole point of entry, but how could Paleolithic people possibly have made such a journey? The proposed route is as daring as the hypothesis itself. During the last glacial maximum, massive ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere. The theory suggests that these ancient mariners did not paddle across the open ocean. Instead, they are thought to have skillfully navigated a corridor of ice, a frigid highway made up of seasonal sea ice and ice shelves stretching from the coast of Iberia to the Grand Banks off Newfoundland. They would have lived a lifestyle similar to that of modern Inuit, hunting marine mammals like seals and walruses from their boats, using the edge of the ice as a platform for hunting and a source of fresh water. This ice edge adaptation would have allowed them to hop from one resource-rich area to the next, slowly making their way west over generations, their survival entirely dependent on a deep understanding of the marine environment. However, the Solutrean hypothesis is far from being widely accepted and faces a mountain of formidable criticism. The most significant challenge comes from genetics. Extensive studies of ancient and modern DNA from Native American populations show a clear and undeniable genetic link to Asia, specifically to Siberian groups, with no evidence of a founding population from Europe. Critics also point to the considerable chronological gap. The Solutrean culture in Europe disappears around 17,000 years ago, while the earliest Clovis points in America don't appear until roughly 13,000 years ago. That's a 4,000-year gap with no clear archaeological evidence in either Europe or along the proposed Atlantic route to bridge the two cultures. Furthermore, no Solutrean campsites, burial grounds, or unequivocal artifacts have ever been discovered in North America. The Thule similarities, skeptics argue, could simply be an example of technological convergence where two separate groups, faced with similar problems and using similar stone resources, independently arrived at a similar, efficient solution for crafting a lethal spear point. Despite the intense debate it sparks, the value of the Solutrean hypothesis lies not in whether it is ultimately proven right or wrong, but in the profound questions it forces us to ask. It challenges the scientific community to remain open to unexpected possibilities and to avoid becoming too comfortable with a single, settled narrative. It pushes us to reimagine the capabilities of our ancient ancestors, granting them the courage, curiosity, and sheer ingenuity to attempt voyages we would have once deemed impossible. Whether this particular corridor existed or not, the discussion itself is a powerful reminder that the human story is incredibly complex, filled with lost chapters and forgotten journeys. The search for answers continues to drive exploration, both on land and beneath the waves, as we strive to piece together the full, magnificent story of how our species came to populate the world. But let's shift our gaze from the frozen Arctic to a completely different kind of corridor, one that was not a product of ice but of life itself. Imagine navigating not across a barren land bridge, but along a vibrant, living highway that stretched for thousands of miles, its green tendrils waving in the ocean currents, teeming with an almost unimaginable abundance of food. This was the coastal Kelp Highway, a maritime superhighway that fringed the entire Pacific Rim from Japan all the way to Baja California. During the lower sea levels of the last ice age, this was not a deep water voyage. It was a journey through a rich, complex, and sheltered environment. The great kelp forests, which thrive in cold, nutrient-rich waters, created a continuous underwater ecosystem that supported an incredible diversity of marine life. For ancient mariners, this wasn't a forbidding ocean to be crossed. It was a plentiful coastline to be followed, a guaranteed source of sustenance that made one of the longest migrations in human history not just possible but plausible. The genius of this route lies in its incredible resource reliability. A kelp forest is far more than just seaweed. It is one of the most productive and dynamic ecosystems on Earth. Its towering underwater canopy provides food and shelter for a staggering array of creatures. The holdfasts, the root-like structures that anchor the kelp to the seafloor, create a complex reef home for abalone, sea urchins, and crabs. The water column within the forest swarms with schools of rockfish, perch, and herring. Seals and sea otters play in the fronds, while seabirds nest on rocky outcrops above. For humans in boats, this was a moving supermarket. They could harvest shellfish from intertidal zones at low tide, fish from the relative safety of their vessels, and hunt marine mammals. This rich and predictable food source meant that migrating groups did not need to carry large quantities of supplies or constantly move inland to hunt unfamiliar game. They could travel live and raise families within sight of the ocean, following this green ribbon of life for generation after generation. This theory fundamentally challenges the old image of our ancestors as primitive wanderers who were terrified of the sea. The Kelp Highway hypothesis casts them as intentional, skilled, and confident mariners. They weren't clinging to the coast in fear, they were expertly exploiting it. The technology required for this journey was sophisticated. They would have needed stable, seaworthy watercraft, likely dugout canoes or skin-covered frames, capable of handling coastal swells and carrying families and their belongings. They also possessed a deep, generational knowledge of oceanography, understanding currents, tides, weather patterns, and navigation by the stars. This wasn't a desperate flight into the unknown. It was a calculated expansion into a known and resource-rich environment. Their journey was likely a process of leapfrogging, where a group would establish a new settlement in a productive bay, explore and exploit the area, and then send out a new generation to find the next suitable location further down the coast. Evidence for this aquatic journey, while elusive due to rising seas drowning the ancient coastline, is gradually emerging from the depths. Archaeologists face a monumental challenge as the campsites of these early mariners are now hundreds of feet underwater, submerged by the same melting glaciers that opened up the route. However, they are finding ways to piece the story together. On islands that were once hills overlooking this coastal plain, such as the Channel Islands off California, scientists have discovered some of the oldest and most compelling evidence. Sites like Arlington Springs on Santa Rosa Island contain human remains dating back nearly 13,000 years, proving that people had already mastered seafaring to reach the islands. Even more telling, these ancient islanders were using delicate, barbed stone points meticulously crafted for hunting sea mammals, and they were processing deep-water fish like tuna, which requires offshore fishing skills. These finds are like scattered clues from a sunken library, confirming that a vibrant, marine-adapted culture was thriving along this pathway. The legacy of the Kelp Highway is a profound reminder that human history is not solely a terrestrial story. For too long, we have looked inward, tracing migrations across continents, while largely ignoring the continental shelves that were once dry land and the coastal routes that were highways. This hidden marine corridor underscores a revolutionary idea that the oceans were not barriers but gateways. They were spaces of connection and abundance that facilitated the rapid peopling of the Americas, potentially even earlier than the inland ice-free corridor had opened up. The great kelp forests, these majestic underwater jungles, were the silent, nurturing guardians of this epic voyage, providing the nourishment and protection that allowed humanity to complete its journey into a new world, forever linking the destiny of our species to the riches of the sea. Now, let's journey to a place that today seems the very definition of desolation and isolation, the Sahara Desert. It is almost impossible to look at its endless, rolling dunes and blistering heat and picture anything else. But what if I told you that this immense arid expanse was once a lush, green paradise, crisscrossed with flowing rivers, dotted with deep freshwater lakes, and teeming with life? This was the reality of the Green Sahara, also known as the African Humid Period, a time when the desert transformed into a vibrant network of corridors that became a superhighway for life, connecting worlds that are now brutally separated. This wasn't a minor change, it was a complete ecological revolution that occurred not just once, but in cycles throughout prehistoric times, fundamentally shaping the story of humanity in Africa. The engine behind this incredible transformation was a slight but powerful wobble in the Earth's orbit. Over cycles of roughly 20,000 years, our planet's tilt and orbit shift in a pattern known as the Milankovitch cycles. These shifts cause subtle changes in how sunlight is distributed across the globe. For the Sahara, This meant periods where the region received significantly more monsoon rainfall. The result was nothing short of miraculous. What is now barren sand would have been covered in sprawling savanna grasslands, acacia trees, and dense scrub. Rivers, some of them mighty enough to be compared to the Nile, carved their way through the landscape, feeding into massive lakes. Lake Mega Chad, for instance, was once the largest freshwater lake on Earth, covering an area larger than the Caspian Sea does today. This green maze created a web of viable pathways through a region that was otherwise an impassable barrier. This newly hospitable environment did not go unnoticed. For the human populations living on its edges, the Green Sahara was an irresistible invitation. Groups from the Mediterranean coast in the north and from sub-Saharan Africa in the south began to move into this newly fertile land. They were not alone. This green world attracted a spectacular array of wildlife that you would never associate with a desert today: herds of elephants, giraffes, hippos wallowing in the lakes, and antelope grazing on the plains. These animals, in turn, attracted hunters. The human groups that moved in were incredibly diverse. Some were skilled fishermen setting up camps on the shores of the Great Lakes. Others were pastoralists herding some of the earliest domesticated cattle, and yet others were hunter-gatherers following the migratory patterns of the game. The Sahara became a melting pot, a place where different cultures, technologies, and ideas could meet and mingle on a scale never before possible in Africa. The most breathtaking evidence of this lost world is not buried underground. It is painted on the walls of caves and rock shelters in the very heart of the desert. In places like the Tassili Ennaja Plateau in Algeria, thousands upon thousands of rock art paintings and engravings create a stunning gallery of the past. These are not crude scratches, they are detailed, vibrant, and lifelike depictions of the world the artists lived in. You can see graceful giraffes charging herds of cattle, hunters with bows and arrows, and even scenes of swimming and dancing. This art is a direct window into a time of abundance and cultural flourishing. It shows us people who were not struggling for survival in a wasteland, but who were thriving in a land of plenty, with the time and spirit to create profound and beautiful art that has endured for millennia. This golden age, however, was not destined to last. As the Earth continued its slow orbital dance, the amount of monsoon rain reaching the Sahara began to diminish. The process of desertification was slow but relentless over centuries. The grasslands began to recede, the rivers started to dry up, and the Great Lakes slowly evaporated, leaving behind vast salt pans. The entire ecosystem began to collapse. The animals either died out or migrated to the remaining green refuges on the desert's edges. The human populations were faced with a stark choice: leave or perish. This great exodus is a pivotal moment in human history. People were forced out of the heart of Africa and into the Nile Valley, where their knowledge and numbers likely contributed to the rise of ancient Egyptian civilization. Others were pushed south into West Africa or back to the Mediterranean coast. This rupture, caused by a changing climate, isolated populations that had once been connected, allowing them to develop in unique directions and contributing to the incredible cultural and genetic diversity we see across Africa today. The story of the Green Sahara is a powerful lesson in the impermanence of our world. It teaches us that environments are not static backdrops to human history. They are active, dynamic forces that propel migration, force innovation, and shape the very fate of civilizations. The desert we see today is not a permanent state. It is simply the current chapter in a long and cyclical story of change. It reminds us that climate shift is not a new phenomenon. Our ancestors lived through it, adapted to it, and were ultimately scattered by it. The silent, sand-covered ruins of their settlements and the beautiful, fading art on the canyon walls stand as a haunting monument to a world that was lost, and a testament to the resilience of those who once called the Green Desert home. While the Green Sahara created pathways across a continent, an even vaster and more dynamic network of connection was taking shape on the open water. Shift your gaze now to the immense expanse of the Indian Ocean, a blue world that seems to separate the continents of Africa, Asia, and Australia. But for ancient mariners, this was not a barrier at all. It was the greatest maritime corridor in human history, a liquid highway of incredible scale and sophistication that buzzed with activity for thousands of years before the Common Era. This was the Indian Ocean Maritime Corridor, a pre-modern internet of trade, ideas, and people that stretched from the bustling ports of East Africa all the way to the Spice Islands of Indonesia. It was here that the first true era of globalization was born, not in boardrooms or through digital networks, but aboard wooden ships powered by the wind and guided by the stars. The secret to unlocking this vast aquatic corridor was not a piece of technology, but a predictable force of nature itself, the monsoon winds. Ancient sailors learned to read the sky and the seasons with incredible precision. For roughly half the year, the winds blow steadily from the southwest, pushing ships from the coast of Africa toward India and the Arabian Peninsula. Then, as if on a celestial schedule, the winds reverse, blowing just as reliably from the northeast, carrying those same ships back home. This seasonal rhythm meant that long-distance travel was not a dangerous gamble against the elements. It was a scheduled, repeatable journey. A merchant could set off from the Horn of Africa, confident that the wind would carry them to their destination, and just as confident that months later, the reversing winds would provide a guaranteed return ticket. This predictability transformed the Indian Ocean from a terrifying unknown into a reliable commercial highway, enabling not just one-off exploration, but sustained and regular exchange across breathtaking distances. The goods that traveled these routes were more than just commodities, they were catalysts for civilization. From the interior of Africa came ivory, gold, and exotic hardwoods. The coasts of Arabia supplied precious frankincense and myrrh, resins so valuable they were worth their weight in gold. The shores of India provided pepper, gemstones, and finely woven cotton textiles. And from the islands of Southeast Asia came the most sought-after treasures of all, cloves and nutmeg. But this corridor traded in far more than spices and luxury items. It was a conduit for the most valuable cargo of all ideas, technologies like advanced shipbuilding techniques, knowledge of metallurgy, and innovative agricultural practices spread from one port to the next. Perhaps most profoundly, this maritime network became the primary vector for the spread of major world religions. Hinduism and Buddhism sailed east from India to shape the cultures of Southeast Asia. Later, Islam would travel along these same routes, carried by peaceful traders rather than conquering armies, weaving a tapestry of faith and culture that still defines the region today. We can trace the astonishing reach of this network through the silent testimony of everyday objects. Archaeologists have found humble pottery shards that tell a grand story. Shattered pieces of distinctive Roman pottery, for instance, have been discovered in abundance at ancient port sites in southern India, proof of a thriving trade that connected the Mediterranean world to the Indian subcontinent. Even more remarkably, coins minted in the Swahili city-states of East Africa have been unearthed in Australia, suggesting connections far more extensive than our history books once acknowledged. But the most compelling evidence often lies hidden beneath the waves. The same monsoon winds that empowered these ancient merchants could also be their doom, sending fully laden ships to the ocean floor. These sunken wrecks are time capsules perfectly preserved on the seabed. Each discovered wreck is an archaeological treasure trove, holding everything from the ship's structure and cargo to the personal belongings of the crew, offering an intimate, untouched snapshot of a single day in a journey that began millennia ago. The legacy of the Indian Ocean Maritime Corridor is nothing short of the foundation of our modern world. It was the engine behind the rise of legendary civilizations. The wealth of the Indus Valley civilization, with its meticulously planned cities, was likely built on trade that reached across these waters. The empires of Mesopotamia, craving the luxury goods of the East, were integral endpoints of this network. This ancient system of exchange demonstrates a profound truth, that human societies have always been interconnected. Long before European explorers set sail, a complex and sophisticated web of economic and cultural interdependence linked the continents bordering the Indian Ocean. It was a world system built not on domination, but primarily on mutual benefit and a shared understanding of the wind and the waves, a testament to humanity's enduring desire to reach out, connect, and build a shared future. We often picture the Silk Road as the first great network of global exchange, a ribbon of commerce and culture linking the empires of Rome and Han China. But this iconic route didn't simply appear out of nowhere. It was the formalization of a much deeper, older pattern of human movement, a pattern etched into the very bones of the Eurasian continent by the footsteps of prehistoric nomads. Long before silk became a coveted luxury, a web of ancient corridors was already stitching east and west together, facilitating an exchange of things far more fundamental than mere goods. These were the original Silk Road precursors, the hidden foundations upon which all later history would be built. The geography of Central Asia itself dictated the paths these early travelers would take. This is a land of extremes dominated by the world's highest mountain ranges, vast, arid deserts, and seemingly endless grasslands known as steppes. For settled agricultural societies, these landscapes were formidable, often impassable barriers. But for the nomadic cultures who called this region home, these features were not obstacles, they were a roadmap. They moved through high mountain passes that offered the only feasible crossing points between valleys. They followed the lifelines of great river systems like the Amu Darya and Sadaria, which provided essential water and grazing for their herds, and they mastered the art of traversing the open steppe, a sea of grass that stretched from the borders of Europe all the way to Mongolia. These natural features, the passes, the rivers, the steppes, formed an interconnected network of corridors that allowed for movement across incredible distances. The masters of these prehistoric trade routes were not merchants in the traditional sense, but nomadic pastoralists. The most famous among these early groups were the Scythians, a confederation of fierce, horse-riding warriors who dominated the steppe from about the 9th to the 1st century before the Common Era. We often think of them as raiders, and indeed they were fearsome in battle, but their true, lasting impact came from their role as facilitators of cross-continental exchange. Their entire culture was built on mobility. They lived in felt tents mounted on wagons, allowing entire communities to move with their herds across the grasslands. This hypermobility meant that a Scythian tribe could act as a cultural and economic link between the sedentary civilizations of China, Persia, and the Greek world on the Black Sea coast. They didn't just carry goods, they carried entire technologies and ideas from one world to the other. The evidence of this profound exchange is spectacularly preserved in the frozen burial mounds, or kurgans, that dot the Siberian and Mongolian landscape. The permafrost has acted as a deep freezer for millennia, protecting organic materials that would have decayed anywhere else. When archaeologists open these tombs, they don't just find bones and gold. they find a frozen snapshot of a connected world. They have discovered exquisite Chinese silks in the graves of Scythian chieftains buried thousands of miles from China. They have uncovered Greco-Roman glassware and intricate Persian textiles in the same tombs as carvings from Siberia. This proves that luxury goods were traversing the continent along these nomadic corridors centuries before the Silk Road was officially established. These items were not acquired through direct trade with these empires, but through a long, complex chain of down-the-line exchange, passed from one group to the next across the vastness of the steppe. But the most significant things exchanged along these routes were not luxuries, but revolutionary technologies that would change the world. The most important of these was the domestication of the horse, which likely first occurred on the steppes of Central Asia. The horse was more than just an animal to these cultures. It was the key that unlocked the continent. It provided unprecedented speed and mobility, allowing people to manage larger herds, travel farther, and yes, wage war more effectively. The knowledge of horse riding, along with associated technologies like the chariot and later the stirrup, spread westward along these corridors, eventually transforming warfare and transportation in Europe and the Middle East. Similarly, advanced metallurgical techniques for working bronze and, later, iron moved along these same pathways. The demand for metals to make weapons and tools fueled trade and drove innovation, connecting mining communities in the Urals with smiths in Anatolia and consumers in every corner of the known world. This deep-seated impulse for connectivity, this ancient web of exchange, created the perfect conditions for the Silk Road to flourish. When the Han dynasty of China and the Roman Empire both reached the peaks of their power and expanded their borders, they didn't create a new system of trade. Instead, they simply plugged into the existing millennia-old network operated by the nomads. They formalized it, protected it with forts and patrols, and intensified the flow of goods. But the pathways themselves, the mountain passes and river valleys, were already there. The knowledge of how to cross the terrible Taklamakan Desert or traverse the Pamir Mountains was already held by the local communities. The Silk Road was not an invention. It was a bureaucratization of a natural human process that had been ongoing since the Stone Age. It shows us that the desire to reach out, to trade, to share ideas, and to connect with others is not a modern concept. It is a fundamental part of who we are, written into the oldest routes our ancestors ever walked. While the steppe corridors of Eurasia were defined by open skies and nomadic movement, a completely different kind of pathway flourished under the dense green canopy of South America. The Amazon rainforest, often portrayed as a pristine and impenetrable wilderness untouched by human hands, holds a secret history written not in stone, but in water and earth. The Amazon River and its countless tributaries did not merely flow through the jungle. They formed the most extensive and complex natural corridor in the prehistoric world, a liquid web of highways that enabled the movement, connection, and flourishing of human societies on a scale we are only beginning to comprehend. This was not a barren landscape waiting for people to arrive. It was a managed, inhabited, and spiritually charged world, and its rivers were the arteries that gave it life. Navigating the Amazon on foot is a near impossible task, a struggle through tangled undergrowth, swampy ground, and a bewildering array of flora and fauna. But for those who took to the water, the equation changed entirely. The river itself was the ultimate path of least resistance. In a dugout canoe, a family or a trading party could cover distances in a single day that would have taken weeks to walk. The main trunk of the Amazon acted as a massive central boulevard, while its tributaries, the Rio Negro, the Madara, the Tapajos, served as smaller streets and neighborhood lanes, branching off into the deepest reaches of the forest. These waterways were predictable, reliable, and most importantly connected everything. A community living at the confluence of two major rivers was effectively at a crossroads of continental importance, with access to goods, people, and ideas from thousands of miles away. The river was their road, their map, and their calendar, its seasonal floods replenishing the land and dictating the rhythms of life. For generations, the prevailing scholarly view was that the Amazon could only support small, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers. The poor soil, known as laterite, was thought to be incapable of supporting the large-scale agriculture necessary for complex societies. This perception of the Amazon as a counterfeit paradise has been utterly shattered by a revolutionary technology, LiDAR. Light detection and ranging radar allows archaeologists to see through the dense forest canopy and map the ground beneath it. What these surveys have revealed is nothing short of astounding. Across the basin, from Bolivia to Brazil, the forest floor is etched with the geometric patterns of ancient civilization. They have discovered vast networks of causeways and raised roads connecting enormous settlements. They have found the outlines of grand plazas, ceremonial centers, and intricate earthworks shaped into perfect circles and squares. Most strikingly, they have identified vast areas of terra preta, anthropogenic dark earth, an incredibly fertile soil created by ancient humans through a sophisticated process of adding charcoal, pottery shards, and organic waste to the naturally poor soil. This was not a wilderness, it was a managed, engineered landscape. The scale of this discovery forces us to completely reimagine pre-Columbian Amazonia. We now know that large, complex chiefdoms and even proto-states flourished along these river corridors. One of the most impressive was the Marajora culture, which thrived on Marajo Island at the mouth of the Amazon around 1,000 years ago. They constructed enormous, intricate burial mounds and produced stunningly beautiful painted pottery, evidence of a sophisticated social hierarchy and artistic tradition. Their success was built on the river's bounty and their own agricultural ingenuity. Similarly, LiDAR has shown that areas like the Upper Tapajos Basin in Brazil were densely populated, with settlements rivaling the size of medieval European towns, all connected by straight, raised roads that ignored the natural topography, showing a clear intent for communication and trade. This was a connected, networked world. The river itself was the engine of this connectivity. It facilitated more than just migration. It enabled a flourishing economy of exchange. Different regions of the vast basin specialized in different resources. One area might be rich in high-quality stone for axe heads, another in prized feathers from macaws and parrots, another in specific types of hardwoods or resins. These goods, along with foodstuffs like dried fish, manioc flour, and fruits, would be traded up and down the river networks. Canoes acted as moving marketplaces, and cultural practices, myths, and technological innovations traveled with them. The river was also a spiritual corridor. Many Amazonian cultures view certain rivers as the homes of powerful deities or ancestors. A journey down river was not just a physical trip, it was a passage through a sacred geography, connecting communities not only through trade but through shared belief systems and cosmological understanding. The true tragedy of the Amazon is that this vast, interconnected world was almost completely erased. The diseases brought by European colonizers, such as smallpox and measles, raced down these very river corridors far ahead of the explorers themselves, decimating populations that had no immunity. It is estimated that up to 95% of the indigenous population perished in the first century after contact. The great settlements were reclaimed by the jungle so completely that within a few generations their existence faded into myth. The modern perception of the Amazon as an untouched Eden is a historical illusion, a testament to the sheer speed and brutality of its collapse. The rainforest we see today is not a pristine wilderness but a garden that has been growing wild for 500 years, its most magnificent structures hidden beneath the roots of trees and the layers of soil. The secrets of the Amazonian river networks remind us that a landscape can be deeply, intimately human, even when it appears utterly wild, and that the most profound connections are sometimes hidden in the flow of a river and the quiet of the forest. Now, let's turn our attention to a pathway that represents one of the most dramatic transformations in human history, the Trans-Saharan Trail. Today, the Sahara Desert stands as the world's largest hot desert, a vast ocean of sand and stone that seems to divide the African continent in two. But this immense barrier was not always so impassable. Long before the famous camel caravans of the medieval era, during those recurring humid periods we now call Green Sahara episodes, a network of trails emerged across this now hostile landscape. This was the prehistoric Trans-Saharan Trail, a corridor that did the unthinkable. It connected the burgeoning cultures of West Africa directly with the sophisticated civilizations of the Nile Valley, turning a continent-spanning obstacle into a bridge for human ambition. The lifeblood of this ancient corridor was not a single road, but a shifting web of routes dictated by the presence of water. During the African humid periods, which occurred in cycles over hundreds of thousands of years, the Sahara would undergo a miraculous metamorphosis. What is now barren erg or sand sea would become a rolling savanna dotted with acacia trees and sprawling grasslands. Instead of endless dunes, prehistoric travelers would have encountered a landscape cut through by flowing rivers and dotted with massive freshwater lakes, some of them larger than modern-day Lake Victoria. These bodies of water were the essential rest stops on this long journey. The trails themselves would have followed the shorelines of these great lakes, wound through valleys carved by now vanished rivers, and connected a chain of watering holes that made the multi-week journey possible. This was not a journey undertaken lightly. It was a calculated risk, timed perfectly to coincide with the climatic golden age of the desert itself. The motivation for such a perilous undertaking was driven by a powerful economic logic, the exchange of resources that were desperately scarce in one region and abundant in another. From the heart of West Africa came one of the most sought-after commodities in the ancient world, gold. The gold fields of the Senegal River Basin and the forests of modern-day Ghana held immense wealth, and this precious metal began to trickle north along these trails. In return, from the north came a substance that was literally worth its weight in gold for communities living in the humid tropics: salt. In the hot, equatorial regions of West Africa, salt lost through perspiration was a constant health threat, and it was a vital preservative for food. The great salt pans of the Central Sahara, like those at Taghaza, provided an inexhaustible supply of this essential mineral. This north-south exchange of gold and salt formed the bedrock of the Trans-Saharan economy for millennia, but it was far from the only thing moving along the trail. Also traveling these routes were exotic goods like cowrie shells from the Red Sea, finely crafted copper tools from the north, and the most valuable cargo of all, ideas. We are granted an astonishingly vivid window into this lost green world thanks to one of the greatest art galleries on Earth, preserved not in a museum but on the open rock faces of the Sahara itself. The Tassili Ennaja Plateau in southeastern Algeria is a UNESCO World Heritage Site that contains over 15,000 petroglyphs and paintings. This open-air archive chronicles the dramatic environmental and cultural changes in the region over thousands of years. The earliest layers of art depict a Sahara teeming with life, graceful giraffes, towering elephants, herds of antelope, and hippopotamuses swimming in lakes that have long since vanished. The human figures shown are often vibrant and active. They are hunters with bows and arrows, pastoralists tending to herds of cattle, and communities engaged in elaborate ceremonial dances. This art is not the product of a people struggling for survival on the edge of existence. It is the confident expression of thriving cultures that were deeply connected to a land of plenty. These images are the most powerful proof we have that the Sahara was not a barrier, but a home and a highway. The ultimate lesson of the Trans-Saharan Trail is a profound testament to human resilience and our innate drive to connect. The people who first ventured across this green desert were not equipped with the specialized technology of later camel caravans. They likely traveled on foot, perhaps with donkeys, guiding themselves by the stars and an intimate, generational knowledge of the land's subtle signs. Their successful navigation of this corridor, despite its immense distances and inherent dangers, speaks to a breathtaking level of courage, planning, and adaptability. They saw opportunity where we now see only emptiness, and they built networks of exchange across a landscape that would later generations seem utterly impassable. This trail proves that human ambition and ingenuity can overcome even the most formidable environmental barriers, fostering connections that seem, from our modern perspective, almost impossible. The story of this trail does not have a happy ending, but its conclusion is a powerful reminder of the forces that shape history. As the Earth's orbit slowly shifted again, the rains began to fail. The process of desertification was slow but inexorable, taking place over centuries. The grasslands began to wither, the Great Lakes shrank into salt flats, and the rivers retreated underground. The green corridors that had made the journey possible slowly closed, one by one, like doors locking across a continent. The communities that had flourished in the Central Sahara were forced to abandon their homes, migrating to the desert's fringes, to the Nile Valley, the Atlas Mountains, and the Sahel. The trails they had walked for generations were buried under sand dunes and forgotten. It would be thousands of years before the introduction of the camel from Asia would finally reopen this desert highway, allowing trade to flow once more, but on a scale the prehistoric pioneers could never have imagined. Their legacy, however, is etched in stone and in the very foundations of African civilization, a hidden chapter of connection that turned a continent of separated worlds into a land of whispered commerce and shared ambition. When we think of the ancient Mediterranean, our minds often leap to the world of Greek triremes, Phoenician traders, and Roman galleys, the classical civilizations that famously ruled these waters. But this bustling maritime world had a deep and astonishing prehistoric precedent, a hidden chapter of exploration that unfolded not thousands, but tens of thousands of years earlier. The blue expanse of the Mediterranean Sea, which appears to separate Europe, Asia, and Africa, was in fact crisscrossed by a web of secret island corridors that served as stepping stones for the very first mariners. These intrepid explorers looked out at the horizon, built simple boats, and set sail for lands they could not yet see, initiating a pattern of island hopping that would forever change the human story of the region. The scale of their achievement is best understood by looking at a map and considering the challenges. Reaching islands like Crete and Cyprus from the mainland is not a matter of a short, casual paddle. Even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, which exposed more coastal land, the voyage to Crete from either Greece or Turkey involved a treacherous open water crossing of at least 40 miles. To ancient sailors in rudimentary vessels, this distance represented a journey into the absolute unknown, completely out of sight of land for hours, if not an entire day. The prevailing currents and winds in the Aegean Sea are complex and could easily sweep a vulnerable craft off course. the decision to embark was an act of incredible courage and faith, driven by a powerful urge to explore, to find new resources, or perhaps to relieve population pressures on the mainland. This was not coastal crawling. This was intentional blue water navigation. For decades, the archaeological establishment held a firm belief that such seafaring prowess only emerged with the Neolithic Revolution, around the time agriculture took hold. The discovery of evidence on Cyprus has completely upended that timeline. Excavations at the site of Akrotiri Itokremnos, and more recently at a site known as Aya Varvara Asprokremnos, have revealed something astounding: stone tools, butchered animal remains, and evidence of human occupation dating back as far as 12,000 years. This places humans on Cyprus in the Mesolithic period, a full 3,000 years before the arrival of agriculture. These first Cypriots could not have walked there. The island has been isolated by deep water for millions of years. Their presence proves unequivocally that sophisticated seafaring existed long before the advent of farming, and that these early people were not just hunter-gatherers, but hunter-gatherer, sailors who possessed the collective knowledge and skill to organize a maritime colonizing expedition. The implications of this early presence ripple across the entire Mediterranean. If people were sailing to Cyprus 12 millennia ago, then the slightly shorter crossing to Crete, which also has tantalizingly early but still debated evidence, becomes entirely plausible. This suggests a pattern of exploration that likely started even earlier. What kind of boats did they use? While no prehistoric boats have survived in the Mediterranean, we can look to other cultures for clues. They almost certainly did not build hollowed-out log canoes, as the Mediterranean lacks the massive straight trees needed for that. It is far more likely they constructed simple yet seaworthy rafts of lashed-together logs, or perhaps framed boats covered in sewn animal hides, similar to the coracles and curraghs used in the North Atlantic. These vessels, powered by paddles and guided by a deep understanding of stars, bird migration patterns, and the feel of the currents, were their spaceships carrying them to new worlds. The cargo they carried in these boats was the very foundation of future civilizations. They did not arrive on these islands as blank slates. They brought with them a sophisticated toolkit of flint and obsidian blades, scrapers, and projectile points, technologies that had been refined on the mainland over millennia. More importantly, they carried the seeds of culture itself, their language, their spiritual beliefs, their art, and their social structures. When agriculture was finally developed on the mainland around 9,000 years ago, it spread across the Mediterranean with surprising speed, not by land but by sea. The same maritime corridors that had been pioneered by Mesolithic hunters were now used by Neolithic farmers to transport their most valuable possessions: domesticated seeds of wheat and barley, and young livestock like sheep, goats, and pigs. The islands became agricultural laboratories where these imported species were raised and sometimes hybridized in isolation. This network of prehistoric sea routes fundamentally changes how we view the Mediterranean. It was never a barrier that isolated cultures from one another. Instead, from the very beginning, it was a liquid highway, a connecting medium that facilitated the exchange of genes, goods, and ideas at a staggering pace. The famous maritime civilizations of the Phoenicians and the Minoans, who emerged millennia later, did not invent Mediterranean trade and connectivity. They inherited it. They simply built upon a network of sea routes that was already ancient history, a web of connections woven by the first brave souls who looked at the endless blue and decided to see what was on the other side. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that the human spirit of exploration is as deep and as old as the sea itself. High up in the thin air of the Andes, where the sky feels close enough to touch and every breath is a conscious effort, another kind of secret corridor was etched into the very roof of the world. Forget the notion of mountains as simple, impenetrable barriers. The colossal spine of South America, running the entire length of the continent, was not a wall but a vast, vertical network of pathways. The Andean mountain passes, some soaring over 20,000 feet above sea level, formed a breathtakingly audacious corridor system that defied the very limits of human endurance to connect two utterly different worlds, the arid Pacific coast and the lush, steaming Amazon basin. This was connectivity achieved not in spite of the extreme environment, but through a profound and ingenious adaptation to it. The genius of this high-altitude network was its ability to create a symbiotic relationship between radically different ecological zones. On one side of the mountains lay the coastal desert, a narrow strip of land squeezed between the ocean and the foothills, where cultures mastered fishing and irrigated agriculture in river valleys. On the other side, the Amazon basin presented an overwhelming abundance of tropical resources: hardwoods, fruits, medicinal plants, feathers, and animal pelts. The communities that developed in the high Andes themselves, in the high-altitude plains known as the Puna or Altiplano, specialized in something else entirely: the domestication of native camelids. They became masters of the llama and the alpaca, animals whose very biology was perfectly suited to the thin air and harsh conditions. No single zone had everything it needed to thrive, but through the mountain passes they had access to it all. This prehistoric exchange was a constant flow of life-changing commodities. From the highlands, caravans of sure-footed llamas, each animal capable of carrying nearly 100 pounds of cargo, would descend toward the jungle. Their loads included freeze-dried potatoes, chuño, high-altitude grains like quinoa and kiwicha, and perhaps most importantly, vast quantities of dried llama meat, charqui, a vital source of protein. In return, the lowlands provided treasures that were utterly irreplaceable. Coca leaves, a mild stimulant that is essential for combating altitude sickness and fatigue, were carried back up to the highlands. So was ají or chili pepper, which became a cornerstone of Andean cuisine. Hardwoods for tools, colorful feathers for ceremonial regalia, and the potent vision-producing brew known as ayahuasca also traveled these routes. This wasn't just trade, it was a necessary ecological strategy for survival and cultural flourishing across extreme vertical gradients. Long before the Inca Empire stamped its own bureaucratic authority onto these trails, weaving them into the famed Quhapac-Ñan, a highway system that rivaled Rome's, these routes were already ancient. Archaeological evidence shows that the use of these passes for long-distance exchange dates back at least 3,000 years to the time of the Chavin culture. The Chavin, centered around a grand temple complex high in the mountains, seem to have been a unifying religious force, and their influence, spread via these very corridors, is seen in art styles and motifs from the coast to the jungle. Later, the Wari Empire expanded upon this network, establishing administrative centers and way stations that previewed the Inca system. The passes themselves were often natural features, a gap between two peaks, a high valley, but their surfaces were sometimes improved with stone paving, and crucial sections might have rudimentary shelters built from rock to protect travelers from the vicious, unpredictable weather that can sweep across the peaks without warning. The true marvel of these corridors lies in the physiological and cultural adaptation they demanded. Living and working at such altitudes requires profound biological changes over generations, including larger lung capacities and a higher concentration of red blood cells to capture precious oxygen. The people who acted as the traders and messengers along these routes, likely specialists within their communities, would have possessed an incredible intimate knowledge of the mountain's moods, where to find shelter from a sudden blizzard, which springs were safe to drink from, and how to navigate by the stars in a landscape where trails could vanish under snow in minutes. They developed a unique material culture for survival, layered clothing made from alpaca wool, which provides superb insulation even when wet, and shoes crafted from tough llama leather. Their ability to thrive in this environment turned the greatest topographical barrier on the continent into its most effective communication network, a testament to human resilience that literally reached for the sky. Stretching from the frigid Atlantic coast of Europe all the way to the windswept plains of Alaska, there existed an ecosystem so vast and so productive that it defies our modern imagination. This was the Mammoth Steppe, a single, continuous grassland that formed the largest biome on Earth during the last ice age. Unlike the silent, frozen tundra we might picture, this was a world teeming with life, a cold, dry, and incredibly fertile prairie that acted as a superhighway for life, connecting continents and fueling one of the most significant chapters in human prehistory. It was a corridor not defined by narrow passes or river valleys, but by sheer, unbroken expanse, a golden highway of grass under the endless Arctic sky. The secret to the steppe's incredible productivity lay in its unique combination of climate and flora. This was not a lush, rainy landscape. It was cold and arid with very little snowfall. This dry cold prevented the formation of the soggy, waterlogged bogs that characterize the modern Siberian tundra. Instead, the land was dominated by highly nutritious, protein-rich grasses, herbs, and sedges that grew in dense, carpet-like formations. This vegetation was perfectly adapted to the conditions, and most importantly, it was evergreen. Even under the weak winter sun, these plants retained their nutritional value, providing a year-round food source for the most spectacular array of megafauna the world has ever seen. This was the realm of the woolly mammoth, the steppe bison with horns spanning 6 feet, the shaggy woolly rhinoceros and giant elk. It was a Serengeti of the Ice Age, but one that operated in temperatures that would be unimaginable on the African savanna. For the bands of Paleolithic hunters who first ventured into this world, the Mammoth Steppe was a land of almost unimaginable opportunity. These were highly adaptable and technologically sophisticated people, armed with finely crafted stone spear points and a deep understanding of their prey. They did not merely stumble into this frozen paradise. They were likely drawn into it, following the migratory trails of the massive herbivore herds that were their lifeline. A single successful mammoth hunt could provide a community with enough food, fat, bone, and ivory to survive for weeks. They used every part of the animal, meat and fat for sustenance, hides and fur for clothing and shelter, bones and tusks to build structures and craft tools. Their survival was a testament to a profound partnership with the megafauna, a relationship that was both predatory and deeply respectful, a dance of life and death on the grandest of scales. The true power of the Mammoth Steppe as a corridor lay in its sheer continuity. A hunter-gatherer group could theoretically travel from the regions of modern-day Spain all the way to the doorstep of North America without ever leaving this productive ecosystem. They didn't need to adapt to drastically new types of food or unfamiliar landscapes every few hundred miles. The same grasses supported the same kinds of animals, which required the same hunting strategies and technologies. This consistency allowed for the incredibly rapid movement of people, and with them, their ideas. A new method for pressure flaking stone to create a sharper spear point, a novel design for a sewing needle made from bone, or a new spiritual belief about the animal world could spread across thousands of miles in a relatively short period of time. This highway of grass became a conduit for culture, innovation, and genes, weaving together the populations of Europe and Asia into a loosely connected web of humanity. This eastward migration across the steppe ultimately set the stage for the single most important journey in the human story, the peopling of the Americas. The mammoth steppe did not end at the Pacific Ocean. During the glacial maxima, with sea levels hundreds of feet lower, this same ecosystem stretched eastward, merging seamlessly with the exposed continental shelf of Beringia. The same grasses, the same cold-adapted animals, and the same human cultures continued across this land bridge. The people who would become the first Americans were not embarking on a voyage into the complete unknown. They were simply following the familiar grazing herds of bison and mammoth into new pastures that were, ecologically speaking, just an extension of the world they already knew. The mammoth steppe was the training ground and the pathway that made this monumental leap possible. Yet this incredible world was living on borrowed time. As the last ice age began to wane around 15,000 years ago, the climate started to shift. The world became warmer and wetter. This change was catastrophic for the specialized steppe ecosystem. The dry cold that sustained the grasslands was replaced by damp, insulating snow cover. The fertile grasses were slowly outcompeted by mosses, shrubs, and eventually waterlogged peat bogs. This new environment, the modern tundra and taiga, was a shadow of its former self in terms of productivity. The great herds of megafauna, so perfectly adapted to the old world, found their food sources disappearing and their habitats fragmenting. One by one, these iconic species vanished, likely succumbing to a combination of climate-driven habitat loss and human hunting pressure. The highway of life became a fractured landscape of isolated pockets and shrinking resources. The disappearance of the mammoth steppe had a profound and lasting impact on humanity. The vast, open corridor that had facilitated movement and connection for millennia suddenly closed. Populations that had once been part of a continuous network became isolated, their cultural and genetic exchange severely limited. This isolation allowed for the distinct diversification of cultures and languages we see across northern Eurasia today. The end of this ecosystem forced humans to adapt once more, turning from specialized big-game hunters of the open plains to generalists who exploited a wider range of resources in forests, along coastlines, and on the rivers. The memory of the great beasts and the open grasslands, however, never truly faded. It lives on in the stunning cave art of Europe, in the myths and legends of indigenous Siberian peoples, and in the very DNA of the populations that once called that frozen Serengeti home. It was a highway that built our world, and its passing marked the end of an era. Now, let's dive beneath the waves of the modern Persian Gulf to uncover one of the most tantalizing lost worlds in human prehistory. Today, this body of water is a busy shipping lane, a strategic waterway flanked by deserts. But rewind the clock just 12,000 years, and you would witness an astonishing transformation. As the last great ice age locked away vast quantities of seawater in glaciers, the global sea level plummeted, exposing the entire floor of the Persian Gulf. What we now see as blue water was, for millennia, a vast, low-lying basin, and it was far from a barren wasteland. Fed by mighty rivers like the Tigris, Euphrates, and Kharon, which flowed through it on their way to the ocean, this exposed landscape became an incredibly fertile oasis, a verdant paradise that may have served as a vital refuge and a superhighway for some of the earliest human migrations out of Africa. This wasn't just a patch of habitable land, it was a sprawling, resource-rich corridor the size of Great Britain. Imagine a lush river valley, wider than anything we see today, with freshwater lakes, marshes teeming with fish and waterfowl, and grasslands supporting herds of gazelle, ostrich, and even wild cattle. For small bands of hunter-gatherers living in a world that was still largely harsh and unforgiving, this Gulf oasis would have been a beacon of life, a sanctuary of abundance in a drying region. Its strategic location made it a perfect crossroads, situated directly between the cradle of Mesopotamia to the northwest and the resource-rich lands of the Indian subcontinent to the southeast. Anyone living in or passing through this oasis would have had access to influences, resources, and ideas from two different worlds, making it a potential melting pot where crucial cultural innovations could have first taken root. The most compelling idea surrounding the Gulf oasis is its potential role as a crucible for one of humanity's most important revolutions, the shift from hunting and gathering to farming. The theory suggests that as the climate warmed and the great ice sheets melted, the surrounding regions like the Zagros Mountains and the Arabian Peninsula began to dry out. Human and animal populations would have been pushed toward the last remaining reliable sources of freshwater, the great river systems feeding into the Gulf Basin. This concentration of people and resources in a relatively small, fertile area could have created the perfect conditions for experimentation. The forced proximity to wild stands of wheat and barley and the herds of aurochs, wild cattle and goats might have prompted the first steps toward domestication. In this sense, the Persian Gulf oasis might not just be a lost corridor, it could be a lost birthplace of agriculture, a precursor to the famous Fertile Crescent that emerged later on its fringes. This golden age of the oasis was ultimately doomed by the very process that created it, climate change. As the world continued to warm, the immense glaciers melted and the oceans began their relentless rise. The waters of the Indian Ocean slowly advanced, first trickling, then flowing, and finally flooding into the low-lying basin. This was not a sudden, biblical deluge, but a slow-motion inundation that took place over centuries, a relentless encroachment that would have been clearly visible within a single human lifetime. Communities would have been forced to retreat again and again, watching their ancestral hunting grounds, their sacred sites, and their homes slowly vanish beneath the waves. This great displacement likely sent waves of climate refugees outward in all directions, carrying with them the knowledge and technologies they had developed in their sunken homeland. Many archaeologists believe these migrants may have been the foundation for the sudden and sophisticated emergence of the first cities in Mesopotamia, like Uruk and Eridu, which appeared as if from nowhere just as the Gulf was completing its submersion. The physical evidence for this lost world is unsurprisingly hidden deep underwater, making it incredibly difficult to find, yet the clues are there. Marine archaeologists have mapped the submerged landscape using seismic surveys and core samples, confirming the existence of the ancient river channels and riverbeds that once crisscrossed the basin. They have even dredged up artifacts, stone tools, and fragments of pottery from the seafloor, providing tantalizing proof of human presence. But perhaps the most compelling evidence lies not on the seabed, but in the myths and stories of the people who lived on the Gulf shores. The Sumerians of Mesopotamia spoke of a pristine, sacred land called Dilmun, a place of creation and immortality, a pure and bright land that was somehow associated with the direction of the rising sun from the east from the sea. Similarly, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes a great flood that wiped out early humanity, a story echoed in countless cultures. These could be distant cultural memories of a real event, the catastrophic loss of a fertile homeland to the rising sea, a trauma so profound it was woven into the very foundation of their identity. The story of the Persian Gulf oasis is a powerful lesson in the fragility of human history. It reminds us that the map of the world is not permanent, and that some of the most important chapters of our past are not buried in the deserts or hidden in the jungles, but are sleeping beneath the waves on the flooded continental shelves. This lost corridor challenges us to think differently, to understand that the rise of civilization was not a simple, linear process on a static map, but a complex story of adaptation to a dramatically changing planet. The submerged world of the Gulf is a silent, underwater museum, holding secrets that could fundamentally reshape our understanding of where we came from, waiting for the day we develop the technology and will to fully explore its depths. While the frozen land bridge of Beringia and the green corridors of the Sahara tell stories of terrestrial migration, the open ocean holds secrets of a different kind of journey, one not across solid ground, but guided by the immense, invisible forces of the sea itself. Picture the North Atlantic not as a terrifying, empty void, but as a dynamic highway system, its lanes defined not by paint but by powerful, flowing currents. The most significant of these was the North Atlantic Drift, the mighty northern extension of the Gulf Stream. This isn't just a gentle flow of water, it's a vast, warm river within the ocean, moving at a steady pace from the Gulf of Mexico across the Atlantic and curling up towards the western coasts of Europe and the frigid reaches of the Arctic. For any culture with the maritime courage to venture beyond the sight of land, this current was more than a natural phenomenon. It was a potential corridor, a hidden guide rope that could, intentionally or accidentally, connect continents. The most famous and well-documented travelers of this aquatic corridor were the Vikings. Their incredible journeys from Scandinavia to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the coast of Newfoundland around the year 1000 are etched into history, supported by both their own detailed sagas and hard archaeological evidence at sites like Eland's Ork's Meadows. But the Viking longships, with their shallow drafts and iconic square sails, were not merely fighting against the ocean, they were learning to read it and use it to their advantage. While they certainly employed skilled navigation by the stars and sun, they would have also become acutely aware of the ocean's patterns. The North Atlantic Drift, with its relatively warmer water and predictable direction, would have acted as a natural aid. A vessel caught in its flow would be carried steadily westward and northward, a fact that could turn a disaster into a discovery. The sagas themselves are filled with tales of ships being blown off course only to sight unknown lands, hints that accidental journeys along this current may have preceded the intentional voyages of exploration. This leads us to a far more tantalizing and controversial possibility, that the Vikings were not the first to ride this current to the New World. The idea of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact is a field fraught with speculation, but the sheer physics of the North Atlantic Drift make it a plausible, if unproven, corridor for sporadic, earlier journeys. Imagine a fishing boat from the coasts of Ireland or Scotland, ventured too far out into the ocean in pursuit of cod. A sudden storm blows them west, and they become caught in the grip of the powerful current. For weeks they are carried along, living off stored supplies and caught fish, until the sea conditions change and they sight the fog-shrouded coast of Labrador or Newfoundland. Survival would be precarious, and establishing a permanent presence nearly impossible for a small, stranded group, but they would have arrived. They might have traded with the local indigenous people, left behind a handful of tools, or simply perished, their story forever lost. This scenario isn't science fiction. It's a demonstrable likelihood given the current's power and the known seafaring capabilities of ancient North Atlantic cultures. The evidence for such pre-Viking contact is fragmentary and hotly debated, which is exactly what we would expect from sporadic, accidental journeys that left no permanent colonies. A controversial stone tower in Rhode Island, known as the Newport Tower, has been pointed to by some as a possible Norse structure, though most archaeologists attribute it to colonial times. A handful of seemingly out-of-place artifacts, like a Norse-style coin found in Maine, could be modern contaminants or the result of trade goods moving through indigenous networks long after the fact. The absence of overwhelming evidence is itself a kind of evidence. It suggests not a sustained migration or colonization effort, but fleeting, accidental landings. The true proof may lie not in grand structures, but in subtler clues, perhaps a specific genetic marker in an isolated population, or a unique tool-making technique shared across the ocean that cannot be explained by independent invention. The mystery endures because the ocean is so effective at swallowing its own secrets. Ultimately, the story of the North Atlantic Drift Corridor forces us to abandon the simplistic textbook narrative of discovery. It challenges the comforting notion that the oceans were absolute barriers until a specific European monarch decided to fund a specific Genos explorer. The reality of human exploration is far messier, more adventurous, and more accidental. The North Atlantic was not a blank space on the map. It was a living, breathing entity with its own rhythms and highways. Daring seafarers, whether from Viking Scandinavia or the Celtic fringes of Europe, were interacting with these forces for millennia, some of them, through a combination of skill, courage, and sheer luck, may have completed the journey long before it was officially recorded. The current invites us to reconsider the scope of prehistoric exploration not as a series of isolated events, but as a continuous, global process where the lines between continents were always more permeable than we once believed, blurred by the constant, flowing motion of the sea. While the North Atlantic Drift hints at potential transoceanic connections, the story of cultural development in East Asia is one of deep, sustained, and powerful internal growth, channeled and nurtured by two of the world's most legendary rivers. Flowing from the high Tibetan plateau down to the fertile plains of the coast, the Yangtze and Yellow rivers were far more than just sources of water. They were the very cradles of Chinese civilization, acting as dynamic corridors that dictated the flow of people, ideas, and innovation for millennia. These rivers didn't just support life, they directed it, creating a unique form of geography-driven evolution where culture flowed as steadily as the current. The contrast between the two river valleys is itself a fascinating tale of how different environments within the same corridor system can foster distinct yet interconnected ways of life. The Yellow River in the north, often called China's Sorrow for its devastating and unpredictable floods, carved its path through vast deposits of fine, wind-blown soil known as loess. This yellow-tinted silt gave the river its name and, when managed correctly, created an incredibly fertile, if challenging, landscape. It was here, in this demanding environment, that millet farming first took root. Millet, a drought-resistant grain, became the staple of the early northern cultures like the Peiligang and later the famed Yongshao, known for their vibrant painted pottery. The need to control the river's floods and manage water for agriculture likely spurred the early development of large-scale social organization and hydraulic engineering, planting the seeds for the centralized states that would follow. Meanwhile, to the south, the Yangtze River presented a completely different world. This was a land of abundant rainfall, lakes, and wetlands, a lush, green environment that stood in stark contrast to the arid north. Here, a separate agricultural revolution was unfolding independently around the same time. Instead of millet, the ancient inhabitants of the Yangtze Valley pioneered the cultivation of rice. At sites like Hemudu, archaeologists have discovered evidence of sophisticated paddy field systems and rice stockpiles dating back over 7,000 years. The Yangtze corridor facilitated a lifestyle more focused on fishing, water management, and the cultivation of this watery grain, leading to cultural expressions that differed from their northern neighbors, often seen in intricate carved jade artifacts and unique architectural styles like stilt houses raised above the wetlands. The true genius of this riverine corridor system was not the isolation of these two cultural hearths, but their eventual interaction. The river valleys did not act as walls separating north and south. They functioned as wide, navigable highways that allowed for the gradual and continuous exchange between these two distinct worlds. Over centuries, ideas, technologies, and people began to move along these waterways. The knowledge of millet cultivation traveled south, while rice agricultural techniques filtered north. Metallurgy, particularly the sophisticated bronze casting technology that reached its zenith under the Shang dynasty, likely benefited from the exchange of ideas and resources that flowed along these rivers. The distinctive ritual bronze vessels, used to communicate with ancestors and assert political power, are a testament to a shared ideological system that was disseminated and refined through these connected corridors. This constant interaction and exchange, facilitated by the rivers, led to a process of cultural amalgamation that is central to the Chinese identity. It wasn't a case of one culture conquering or erasing the other. Instead, it was a long, slow process of blending and synthesis. Elements from the Yangtze Valley, such as certain religious concepts and artistic motifs, were absorbed into the emerging classical Chinese civilization that was crystallizing in the Central Plains, the region between the two great rivers. This melting pot effect, powered by the connectivity of the waterways, created a resilient and multifaceted culture that could draw on the strengths of both its northern and southern roots. The rivers ensured that innovation in one area could become a resource for all, preventing cultural stagnation and fostering a unique form of unity amidst diversity. The archaeological record along these riverbanks is a palimpsest of this incredible journey. Sites like Banpo on the Yellow River show a large, planned Neolithic village with evidence of millet farming and pottery production. At Liangzhu, near the Yangtze Delta, a massive complex of canals, mounds, and jade workshops speaks to a highly organized society with a deep spiritual life centered around jade artifacts thousands of years before the Shang dynasty. These sites are not isolated dots on a map. They are points connected by the flowing lines of the rivers, each excavation revealing another piece of the story of trade, migration, and cultural cross-pollination. Every broken pot shard, every discarded tool, and every carefully constructed tomb tells a story of lives lived in constant dialogue with the river and with each other. The legacy of the Yangtze and Yellow River corridors is etched into the very soul of East Asia. They demonstrate that civilization is rarely born from a single point of origin, but more often from the fruitful interaction between different yet connected regional innovations. The rivers provided the structure for this interaction, a natural network that ensured that the groundbreaking developments in agriculture, social organization, and technology did not remain local secrets but became part of a shared heritage. This deep history of connectivity helps explain the enduring cultural continuity of China. It is a civilization that grew along its arteries, its heart beating between two great rivers, drawing strength from both banks and forever shaped by the relentless, life-giving flow of water. Far to the south, at the very end of the world, lies a landscape of almost mythical harshness and beauty, Patagonia. This is a land where the Andes Mountains are swallowed by colossal sheets of ice and ferocious winds scream across vast, empty steppes. It feels like a place at the edge of existence, a final frontier. Yet, against all logic, ancient humans not only reached this formidable land but thrived within it. Their secret lay in navigating a network of treacherous pathways known as the Patagonian ice field passes, frigid corridors through the frozen heart of the continent that enabled the very last great chapter of the human journey into the unknown. To understand the sheer scale of their achievement, you must first grasp the challenge they faced. The Patagonian ice field is the largest expanse of ice in the southern hemisphere outside of Antarctica, a frozen desert of glaciers hundreds of meters thick. This icy barrier effectively cuts off the Pacific side of the continent from the Atlantic. For any group moving southward along the Andes, this was the ultimate roadblock. Going around it to the east meant venturing into the dry, windswept pampas, a landscape with its own perils and scarce resources. Going around it to the west was impossible, as the ice field tumbles directly into the frigid ocean. The only way through was quite literally over the top. They had to find the passes, the high, icy saddles between mountain peaks where the ice was thinnest and the crossing most feasible. This was not a journey for the unprepared. It demanded a level of adaptation so profound it borders on the supernatural. The people who mastered these routes, the ancestors of the indigenous Tehuanch and later the Arnaiking peoples, developed a technology and a way of life perfectly suited to the cold. They crafted warm, wind-resistant clothing from the skins of guanacos, a local camelid, sewing them with sinew and adorning them with intricate painted patterns. They developed portable shelters, simple windbreaks or small huts made of skins and branches that could be quickly erected against the punishing gales that can blow for weeks on end. Their entire survival kit was a masterpiece of minimalism and efficiency. Every item essential, every ounce of weight calculated for the arduous climb ahead. But their most crucial adaptation was a deep, generational knowledge of the ice itself. This wasn't just frozen water, it was a living, shifting, and deeply dangerous entity. They learned to read the surface of the glaciers, identifying hidden crevices masked by thin snow bridges. They understood the weather patterns, knowing when a period of calm might offer a narrow window for a crossing, and when an approaching bank of cloud signaled a deadly storm. This knowledge wasn't written down, it was passed through oral tradition and practical experience, a sacred geography of survival etched into memory. They moved in small, highly coordinated family groups, their survival dependent on each member's skill and the shared wisdom of their ancestors. The evidence for this incredible feat of exploration was unearthed in places like Fell's Cave, a rock shelter perched in the windswept landscape of Chilean Patagonia. Excavations there, led by archaeologists like Junius Bird in the 1930s, revealed a treasure trove of human history sealed under layers of ancient sediment. They discovered finely crafted stone tools, the remains of hunted animals like the extinct giant ground sloth, and the ashes of campfires that had been lit over 12,000 years ago. This was definitive proof that humans had not only reached the southern tip of the Americas astonishingly early, but had done so with a sophisticated toolkit. The artifacts told a story of a people who were not lost or desperate, but who were successful, specialized hunters, fully adapted to their severe environment. What makes the Patagonian story so compelling is that it represents the absolute end of the line. After tens of thousands of years of migration out of Africa, across Asia, over the Bering Land Bridge, and down the entire double continent of the Americas, there was nowhere further south to go. The journey that began under the African sun culminated here, in this world of ice and rock, under the brilliant constellations of the Southern Cross. The peopling of Patagonia is the period at the end of the long sentence of human global expansion. Those who settled there did so in profound isolation, developing unique cultural practices and a spiritual world deeply intertwined with the dramatic and unforgiving land that surrounded them, a testament to human resilience that stands as one of our species' most awe-inspiring achievements. Now let's journey to a landscape that today defines the very idea of aridity, the vast sun-scorched expanse of the Arabian Peninsula. It's a place of towering sand dunes and relentless heat where life clings to a precious few oases. But this harsh desert was not always so unforgiving. In fact, it holds one of the most pivotal secrets in the entire human story. During repeated cycles of a greener climate, the Arabian Peninsula underwent a breathtaking transformation, becoming a lush network of savannas, rivers, and lakes. These were the green pastures of Arabia, a lost paradise that acted as a vital bridge, channeling the very first waves of human migration out of Africa and into the wider world. This wasn't a minor ecological shift. It was a complete overhaul of the landscape that made the impossible possible. The engine behind this incredible change was the same rhythmic dance of the Earth's climate that greened the Sahara. As the planet's orbit shifted over millennia, the monsoon rains that now barely graze the southern coast were pulled much farther north, drenching the peninsula's interior. What is now the empty quarter, the world's largest continuous sand desert, would have been a rolling grassland, dotted with acacia trees and cut through by permanent river systems. Vast freshwater lakes, some over 100 kilometers long, dotted the landscape, attracting a spectacular array of wildlife. This wasn't a minor wet period. It was the creation of an entirely new biome, a green corridor that literally connected the doorstep of Africa to the gates of Asia. For any human or hominin group in East Africa looking toward the horizon, this was not a barrier but an invitation. This green gateway did not swing open just once. It did so repeatedly, creating pulses of opportunity for migration over hundreds of thousands of years. The first to venture into these grasslands were not our own species, Homo sapiens, but our ancient cousins, groups of Homo erectus, equipped with their iconic hand-axe technology, likely followed animal herds into this new land over 1 million years ago. They were followed by other hominins, each wave taking advantage of these temporary windows of hospitable climate. Then, around 60 to 70,000 years ago, the stage was set for the most crucial journey of all. The first modern humans, Homo sapiens, stepped out of Africa and into this Arabian paradise. They were not embarking on a desperate trek across a desert. They were walking into a well-watered, game-rich landscape that offered a clear and viable path forward. The evidence for this lost world is not just theoretical. It is being unearthed from the very sands that buried it. Paleontologists and archaeologists combing the deserts of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have made stunning discoveries. They have mapped the ancient shorelines of massive, long-vanished lakes. On the beds of these fossil lakes, they have found the stone tools left behind by these ancient pioneers, elegantly flaked hand axes from the earlier hominin migrations, and later, the more sophisticated blade-based toolkits of Homo sapiens. In a find that sent ripples through the scientific community, a fossilized human finger bone was discovered in the Nefer Desert, dating back around 90,000 years. This single fragment of bone is the oldest directly dated Homo sapiens fossil ever found outside of Africa and the Levant, offering tangible proof that our ancestors were not just passing through, but were thriving in the heart of this green Arabia. This entire chapter of human history was ultimately sealed away by the very force that created it, climate change. As the Earth's orbital cycle shifted once more, the monsoon rains retreated south. The grasslands began to wither under the intensifying sun. The mighty rivers slowed to a trickle and then vanished, their courses now only visible from satellite imagery. The Great Lakes evaporated, leaving behind vast, blinding white salt flats as their only tombstones. The lush corridor that had served as a highway for millennia transformed into the most formidable desert on Earth, effectively slamming the door shut on this route out of Africa. The evidence of this profound human story was buried under layers of sand, hidden from view for tens of thousands of years. the significance of the Arabian green corridors cannot be overstated. They force us to completely rethink the narrative of the out-of-Africa migration. The traditional map with a single arrow arching north through the Sinai Peninsula is now understood to be far too simple. The journey was likely a complex series of pulses with multiple groups using multiple routes, and the Arabian Peninsula provided a southern highway that was every bit as important as the northern one. This realization makes our story messier but infinitely richer. It shows that our ancestors' expansion was not a single, linear event, but a dynamic response to a changing planet, a testament to our species' incredible ability to seize opportunity wherever it arose. The deserts of Arabia, so silent and empty today, hold the echoes of our deepest origins, reminding us that the maps of our past are written not just in stone and bone, but in the ever-shifting climate of the Earth itself. Flowing from the Black Forest of Germany all the way to the Black Sea, the Danube River carves a path through the very heart of Europe, acting as a natural highway through a continent of dense forests and formidable mountain ranges. For prehistoric communities, this was not merely a body of water. It was the ultimate path of least resistance, a pre-marked route that offered clear navigation, a constant source of fresh water, and fertile banks teeming with life. While other rivers might have served local needs, the Danube's unique east-west orientation and immense length made it a continental-scale corridor, a liquid thread that would eventually weave together the disparate cultural fabrics of Southeast and Central Europe, setting the stage for a demographic and ideological revolution that would forever alter the trajectory of human history on the continent. This river's role as an engine of change reached its zenith with one of the most significant transitions in human existence, the Neolithic Revolution, the shift from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled farming. This new way of life, with its domesticated plants like wheat and barley and animals like sheep and goats, first emerged in the Fertile Crescent of the Near East. But how did this complex package of ideas, species, and technologies travel over 1,000 miles to transform Europe? The answer lies not in a single wave of migration, but in a slow, steady diffusion of people and knowledge known as the Danubian route. Archaeologists trace this movement through a distinct archaeological culture called the linear pottery culture, named for the characteristic incised lines decorating their ceramics. These were some of Europe's first farmers, and they didn't blaze a trail through the wilderness. They paddled and walked along the well-defined and inviting corridor of the Danube and its tributaries. The journey of these pioneering farmers was a process of leapfrogging expansion, a gradual movement that unfolded over centuries. A community would establish a settlement on the fertile lower soils near the river, clear some forest for fields, and raise their crops and livestock. Within a generation or two, population growth or the search for new land would push a splinter group to move further along the river, establishing a new village perhaps 50 miles upstream. This pattern repeated itself over and over, creating a chain of culturally connected settlements that stretched from the river's headwaters all the way to the Great Hungarian Plain. The river was their guide and their lifeline, connecting these scattered communities and ensuring a flow of goods, genes, and, most importantly, information. A successful new technique for storing grain or a solution for dealing with crop blight could travel quickly along this network, accelerating adaptation and ensuring the stability of this new, fragile agricultural lifestyle. The archaeological record along the Danube's banks is a rich tapestry that tells this story of interaction and innovation. At the famous site of Lepenski Vrh in Serbia, we see a fascinating moment of cultural encounter. This was first a settlement of highly sophisticated Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who built unique trapezoidal houses and created stunning sandstone sculptures of aquatic deities. Then the farmers arrived. Rather than a story of immediate displacement or conflict, the evidence suggests a period of coexistence and exchange. The hunter-gatherers began to incorporate some aspects of the new Neolithic package, perhaps trading fish for pottery, while maintaining their own distinct identity and spiritual practices. Further upstream, in Austria and Germany, massive excavations of linear pottery villages reveal longhouses that could stretch over 30 meters in length, housing extended families and their livestock under one roof. These structures, arranged in clear patterns, speak to a well-organized social structure that was perfectly adapted to its new, settled life, a life made possible by the connectivity of the river. The ultimate legacy of the Danube corridor is etched into the very DNA of modern Europe. The movement of these early farmers along the river valley was not just a cultural transfer, it was a major demographic event. Genetic studies confirm that this was a migration of people, not just ideas. They brought with them not only their farming techniques but also their genetic signatures, which blended with those of the indigenous Mesolithic populations to create the genetic landscape of Central Europe today. The river facilitated this great mingling, this biological and cultural fusion that gave rise to the complex tapestry of European societies. It was a highway that carried more than just traders and travelers. It carried a whole new way of being, fundamentally reshaping the relationship between humans and the land, and setting in motion the patterns of settlement and conflict that would define the continent for millennia to come. Far to the south of the Australian mainland, a profound and lasting separation unfolded, creating a unique natural experiment in human cultural development. This is the story of the Tasmanian Land Bridge, a now vanished corridor that once connected the island of Tasmania to the continent of Australia during the last glacial period. As global sea levels dropped by over 120 meters, the shallow base strait was entirely drained, revealing a flat, low-lying plain of land that was, for all intents and purposes, a seamless extension of the southern Australian coast. This was not a narrow isthmus but a substantial landmass, nearly 200 kilometers wide in places, creating a gateway that allowed people, animals, and ideas to flow freely between the two regions. For the Aboriginal communities who had already mastered the Australian continent, this newly exposed territory was simply more country to explore, settle, and incorporate into their vast spiritual and physical geography, known today as the Dreaming. This land bridge facilitated one of the final chapters in the human settlement of Sahul, the combined prehistoric continent that included Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. Groups moving southward would have found a cool, grassy plain in Bass Strait, likely rich with game like kangaroos and wallabies, making the journey not just possible but inviting. They eventually reached and settled the island of Tasmania, establishing communities that thrived in its diverse environments, from its rugged coastlines and temperate rainforests to its high central plateau. Archaeological evidence, such as the rich sites found at Warren Cave and the Nunnamira Rock Shelter, shows a continuous human presence dating back at least 35,000 years. These were not isolated castaways, they were part of a vast, connected social network that stretched back to the mainland, sharing technologies, cultural practices, and genetic ties with their northern relatives. Tools made from stone sourced hundreds of kilometers away on the mainland have been found in Tasmanian sites, silent proof of this active exchange. This era of connection came to a definitive end as the world warmed. Starting around 18,000 years ago, the great ice sheets began to melt, and the oceans started their relentless rise. The waters of the Southern Ocean slowly encroached upon the low-lying plains of the Bashan Land Bridge. This was not a sudden cataclysm but a slow-motion flood that unfolded over millennia, a creeping inevitability that would have been visible within the oral history of the Tasmanian people. They would have watched their ancestral hunting grounds, their sacred sites, and their physical connection to the wider world gradually vanish beneath the waves. By around 10,000 years ago, the process was complete. The Bass Strait was fully inundated, and Tasmania was transformed from a peninsula into an island, completely severed from the Australian mainland by a tempestuous stretch of water known for its rough seas and fierce weather. This geographic isolation had a profound and unique impact, creating a fascinating and at times tragic case study in human cultural evolution. Cut off from the constant flow of ideas and people that stimulates innovation and cultural exchange on the mainland, Tasmanian Aboriginal society developed along its own distinct trajectory. Over the ensuing millennia, archaeologists have noted what appears to be a gradual simplification of their material culture. Technologies that were once commonplace, such as the use of bone tools like needles and the knowledge required to craft fishing gear, disappeared from the archaeological record. This was not a sign of intellectual decline, but a powerful example of cultural adaptation to isolation. In a small population with limited contact, complex skills can be lost if they are not constantly practiced and taught. If a master bone toolmaker died without an apprentice, that knowledge could vanish forever. The resources needed for fishing may have also become less accessible, or the cultural focus may have shifted entirely to the abundant resources on land, making the technology unnecessary. Their culture became perfectly and uniquely adapted to the island environment they found themselves in. The result was the development of the most distinct and isolated human culture on Earth by the time European explorers arrived in the 17th century. Having been separated for 10,000 years over 500 generations, the Tasmanian Aboriginal people had developed a completely unique language, mythology, and spiritual relationship with their island home. Their genetic isolation was also nearly total, creating a population that was genetically distinct from all other human groups. This incredible preservation of a unique cultural and genetic heritage is the direct legacy of that submerged land bridge. It stands as a powerful and sobering lesson in how geography shapes human destiny. The same corridor that first allowed people to reach Tasmania ultimately, through its disappearance, became the agent of their profound isolation, protecting a unique human story for millennia until the modern world suddenly and violently arrived on its shores. Rising like a formidable stone wall between the Black Sea and the Caspian, the Caucasus Mountains present a breathtaking barrier of jagged peaks and deep, shadowed gorges. To glance at a map, one might see only a dividing line, a natural border cleaving Europe from Asia. But for the cunning and the courageous throughout history, these mountains were not a wall at all. They were a sieve, pierced by a hidden web of narrow, treacherous passes that acted as some of the world's most vital and volatile secret corridors. This rugged landscape, where the air grows thin and the weather turns in an instant, became an unlikely crossroads, a place where the destinies of empires and nomadic steppe cultures were decided not on open battlefields, but in the tight, strategic confines of a mountain defile. The value of these passes lay in their exclusivity and their sheer necessity. While the flat, open expanses of the steppe to the north offered easy travel, they also left travelers exposed and vulnerable. The Caucasus provided a more protected, direct route for those who knew how to navigate it. But this was not a journey for the faint of heart. Passes like the legendary Darial Gorge, later known as the Caspian Gates, were so narrow that in places, a handful of defenders could hold off an army. The terrain itself was the ultimate gatekeeper, demanding a specific, local expertise. Knowledge of these routes was a precious commodity, fiercely guarded by the mountain-dwelling communities who controlled them. They knew which pass was clear of snow in which season, where to find shelter from a blizzard, and which narrow trail offered the safest passage away from rockfalls and avalanches. This intimate knowledge gave these local groups immense power, allowing them to act as guides, toll collectors, or formidable opponents to anyone wishing to cross their domain. What flowed through these stone arteries was nothing less than the building blocks of ancient civilizations. The Caucasus foothills are incredibly rich in metal ores, particularly copper and later, high-quality iron. This turned the region into a prehistoric industrial hub. The knowledge of advanced metallurgy, how to smelt, alloy, and craft metal into superior tools and weapons did not stay put. It traveled outwards along these mountain passes, carried by traders and migrating smiths. This technology spread north to the steppe nomads, who forged it into stronger weapons and horse gear, and south into the sophisticated kingdoms of the Near East, where it was used for everything from agricultural tools to royal finery. The movement of metal was so profound that the very names of these materials may have journeyed with them. Some linguists suggest the word silver itself has its roots in the ancient languages of this region, a permanent linguistic fossil of this early exchange. But it wasn't just goods and technologies that moved, it was people and their ideas. The Caucasus passes served as a revolving door for countless cultures over millennia. Wave after wave of nomadic peoples from the great Eurasian steppe, the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Alans pushed south through these gates, drawn by the wealth of the ancient empires in Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Sometimes they came as raiders pouring through a pass to plunder and then retreat. Other times they came as migrants settling in the mountain valleys and foothills, their culture blending with those of the local inhabitants. This constant influx made the region a breathtakingly diverse linguistic and ethnic mosaic that persists to this day. It became a zone where Indo-European languages from the north met Semitic languages from the south, and mysterious, ancient language isolates with no known relatives, like Georgian, survived and thrived in the protective isolation of the high valleys. This role as a crossroads meant the Caucasus was perpetually caught in the tides of conquest. Every major power that sought to control the bridge between Europe and Asia had to contend with these mountains. The Achaemenid Persians fought legendary battles against the fierce Scythians in the northern passes. Centuries later, the Roman Empire, recognizing the strategic imperative, fortifies the Darial Gorge in a desperate attempt to stem the tide of nomadic incursions from the north. They built walls and stationed legions in this remote, harsh environment, a testament to the pass's critical importance. Control of these corridors meant controlling the flow of armies, the wealth of trade, and the spread of ideas. To hold a key pass was to hold a knife to the throat of continents, a fact every ambitious conqueror from Pompey the Great to Tamerlane understood all too well. The enduring legacy of these mountain corridors is a powerful reminder that our definitions of barriers and bridges are often a failure of imagination. We look at a mountain range and see division, but our ancestors looked at the same peaks and saw opportunity, challenge, and a path to connection. The Caucasus stands as a monumental testament to this truth, that the most imposing landscapes can hide the most vital pathways, and that the greatest exchanges in human history often occurred not on the open road, but in the secret, whispering confines of a high mountain pass, where the world literally narrowed to a single file of travelers carrying the future on their backs. Flowing from the high Tibetan plateau all the way to the vibrant delta of Vietnam, the Mekong River carves one of the world's most dynamic and life-giving corridors, a pulsing artery of water that has nourished human ambition for millennia. This is not a single, simple river, but a vast and intricate network, a sprawling web of tributaries, distributaries, and seasonal floodplains that stitches together 6 modern nations. For ancient peoples, this liquid network was the ultimate superhighway, offering a clear path through a landscape of dense, mountainous jungles that would have been nearly impenetrable by land. To travel by boat along the Mekong was to unlock the entire region, connecting the high-altitude cultures of southern China with the burgeoning societies of the tropical south in a continuous flow of people, ideas, and innovation. The river's most profound gift, and the very foundation of civilization in the region, was its spectacularly predictable seasonal rhythm. Each year, the monsoon rains and the melting snows from the Himalayas would cause the Mekong to swell far beyond its banks, transforming the surrounding landscape. This was not a destructive flood, but a creative one. As the waters slowly receded, they left behind a thick, nutrient-rich layer of silt across vast floodplains, creating some of the most fertile agricultural land on Earth. This annual delivery of natural fertilizer meant that societies could rely on incredibly productive harvests of rice, fostering population growth and stability. The river didn't just provide water, it provided the very soil for prosperity, inviting settlement and rewarding those who learned to harmonize their lives with its powerful, life-giving cycle. This agricultural bounty became the engine for cultural complexity. With a secure food supply, societies could specialize. Some communities became masters of riverine fishing, developing elaborate nets and traps to harvest the Mekong's astonishing diversity of aquatic life, including the legendary giant catfish. Others focused on metallurgy, using the river as a trade route to distribute their finely crafted bronze ritual vessels and iron tools across the region. The most crucial innovation, however, was water management. To maximize the river's gift and protect against its occasional fury, early engineers began constructing sophisticated systems of canals, dikes, and reservoirs. This knowledge of controlling water wasn't just practical, it was the foundational technology of power. The ability to store water for the dry season and to irrigate vast fields was what would later allow empires to flourish. The ultimate expression of this Mekong-fed civilization was the magnificent Khmer Empire, with its heartland anchored by the Tonle Sap Lake, a unique hydrological feature intrinsically linked to the Mekong. Each wet season, the swollen Mekong actually forces so much water backward into the Tonle Sap River that the lake expands to 5 times its dry season size, creating an incredibly rich fishery. The Khmer genius was in harnessing this entire system. Their crowning achievement, the temple complex of Angkor Wat, is just the most visible part of a staggering hydrological network of canals, barrages, massive reservoirs, and intricate irrigation channels that managed water for agriculture, transportation, and ritual purposes. The empire's wealth and power were quite literally built on water, all made possible by the Mekong's generous and predictable flow. Yet the Mekong's role extended far beyond the grand empires. It was a corridor of everyday connection and cultural exchange. A unique style of pottery found in a village in Laos might show clear influences from designs originating in Cambodia, carried north by traders plying the river. Stories, religious beliefs, and linguistic nuances would travel in the same way, blending and evolving with each stop along the riverbank. The river acted as a cultural blender, ensuring that while each community developed its own distinct identity, they were all part of a shared, interconnected world. The water itself was a spiritual entity, home to powerful deities and spirits known as Nagas, which were revered from source to delta, creating a common spiritual geography that transcended political boundaries. The legacy of the Mekong is a powerful lesson in seeing rivers not as dividers but as unifiers. Its currents carried more than just water. They carried the dreams of engineers, the prayers of farmers, the ambitions of kings, and the artistry of countless unnamed craftspeople. It reminds us that some of humanity's greatest achievements are not just monuments of stone, but are woven into the very landscape, in the quiet flow of a canal and the fertile soil of a rice paddy, all gifts from the relentless, nurturing pulse of the great river. While the great ice sheets of the last glacial maximum covered much of northern Europe in a crushing, miles-thick layer of ice, not all of Scandinavia was locked in this frozen grip. Along the coastlines of modern-day Norway, tucked into deep fjords that were protected by the warming influence of the ocean, and in scattered pockets of higher ground that remained above the ice, there existed fragile sanctuaries known as ice-free refugia. These were not vast, hospitable lands, but rather small, isolated pockets of life, rocky shorelines, barren plateaus, and wind-scoured islands where the relentless advance of the glacier was held at bay. Within these harsh but habitable oases, a remarkable story of survival unfolded, as both animal and human populations clung to existence, waiting out the long winter of the world. The true significance of these refugia lies in what they preserved. As the ice expanded, it effectively scoured the land clean, wiping away any evidence of previous habitation and pushing life southward into warmer European latitudes. But these northern pockets acted as biological arks, safeguarding a unique reservoir of genetic diversity. Hardy species like reindeer, Arctic fox, and aurochs found shelter here, their populations becoming genetically distinct from their southern relatives due to millennia of isolation. For humans, the stakes were even higher. Small bands of highly specialized hunter-gatherers, descendants of those who had first moved into the region, learned to exploit the narrow margin of resources these refugia offered. They became masters of the marine environment, harvesting seals, fishing from the ice edges, and hunting seabirds, developing a culture and a toolkit perfectly adapted to the extreme cold and limited resources. They were the guardians of a northern way of life, preserving knowledge and traditions that would be crucial for the recolonization to come. Then, the world began to change. As the climate warmed and the great glaciers started their slow, grinding retreat, they revealed a transformed landscape. The immense weight of the ice had depressed the land itself, and as it melted, the sea followed closely behind, flooding the low-lying areas that were now released from the ice's burden. This created a dramatic and ever-changing coastline of fjords, islands, and archipelagos. For the people waiting in the refugia, this was their moment. They began to expand, not as invaders from the south, but as pioneers moving out from their northern strongholds. They followed the retreating ice edge, tracking the herds of reindeer that grazed on the newly exposed tundra, and they explored the new coastal waterways in their skin boats, becoming the first people to set foot on landscapes that had been buried under ice for tens of thousands of years. Their genetic signature, preserved in isolation, became a key component in the peopling of northern Europe. Some of the most compelling evidence for this lost world now lies at the bottom of the sea, particularly in the area known as Doggerland. This vast expanse of low-lying plains, which once connected Great Britain to mainland Europe across what is now the North Sea, was a rich and densely populated landscape during the Ice Age. As the seas rose, Doggerland was slowly inundated, its forests, rivers, and hills swallowed by the waves. Today, fishermen trawling the Dogger Bank have hauled up more than just fish. They've recovered the bones of mammoths and lions, ancient stone tools, and even finely crafted bone spear points. These finds are random and poignant glimpses of a drowned world, confirming that the area now covered by the turbulent grey waters of the North Sea was once a thriving heartland for human and animal communities, a crucial part of the network of habitats that allowed life to persist through the Ice Age. The story of the Scandinavian refugia is ultimately one of profound patience and strategic adaptation. It demonstrates that human history is not always a story of constant migration and expansion. Sometimes it is about hunkering down, about learning the intricate details of a very small and demanding world, and about waiting for the right moment. These communities did not just survive, they used their time in isolation to refine the technologies and strategies that would allow them to become the first effective colonists of the post-glacial North. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that resilience is not just about enduring hardship, but about preserving the knowledge and the genetic diversity that will be needed to thrive when the world finally, inevitably, begins to change again. Deep within the heart of West Africa, a different kind of secret corridor flourished, one woven not from ice or stone, but from living, breathing forest. Imagine the continent not as a static map of separate biomass, but as a dynamic, breathing entity. During periods of increased rainfall, the dense, towering rainforests of the central Congo basin did not simply sit in place. They sent out tendrils, expanding north and south into the surrounding savannas. These were the Guinean forest corridors, vibrant ribbons of dense woodland that pierced the open grasslands, creating a network of sheltered pathways through an otherwise exposed landscape. For the human communities living along these edges, these green passageways were not just strips of trees. They were bridges between worlds, offering safe passage, valuable resources, and a clear route for the most significant demographic movement in the history of Africa. The true power of these forest corridors was unlocked by a revolutionary set of technologies that transformed how people interacted with the land. This was the Bantu expansion, a millennia-long migration that would eventually spread Bantu-speaking peoples across a third of the African continent, from the borders of modern-day Nigeria all the way to the southern coast. This was not a sudden, militaristic invasion, but a gradual, relentless process of diffusion, and its engine was a powerful cultural package. These communities were not just hunters and gatherers. They were pioneers of early agriculture, cultivating yams and oil palm within the forest clearings. Perhaps even more importantly, they mastered the sophisticated technology of ironworking, the ability to smelt iron ore and forge it into superior, durable tools, razor-sharp axes for clearing forest, stronger hoes for tilling soil, and formidable weapons gave them a profound advantage. This technological edge allowed them to modify their environment more effectively, manage larger territories, and support growing populations, creating a demographic pressure that naturally pushed them to explore new lands. The forest corridors provided the perfect highway for this expansion. Moving through open savanna would have been dangerous, exposing communities to predators, rival groups, and the elements. But the forest corridors offered a sheltered, resource-rich environment for migration. They could move along these green tunnels, following familiar plant species and game animals, with a constant source of wood, water, and shelter. It was a journey of generations, not years. A community would establish a settlement in a new area along the corridor, practice their slash and burn agriculture for a few generations until the soil was depleted, and then a splinter group would move further down the line, always following the guidance of the forest. This slow, leapfrogging movement meant that their language, their agricultural practices, and their ironworking knowledge spread with them, not through conquest, but through the steady, organic process of settlement and cultural influence. The impact of this migration, facilitated by these natural pathways, is almost impossible to overstate. As Bantu-speaking farmers moved into new regions, they encountered communities of indigenous hunter-gatherers, like the Pygmy groups of the central rainforest and the Khoisan-speaking peoples of southern Africa. The encounters were complex and varied. In some areas, there was likely trade and cultural exchange, with the new agricultural techniques being adopted by existing populations. In other areas, the Bantu expansion may have led to the absorption or displacement of these older communities. The result was a profound reshaping of the linguistic and genetic map of sub-Saharan Africa. The hundreds of Bantu languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people today, from Swahili on the coast of Kenya to Zulu in South Africa, all stem from this original expansion through the forest corridors thousands of years ago. This incredible story is a supreme example of how human history is a dialogue with a changing climate. The very existence of these forest corridors was dictated by shifts in rainfall patterns. A period of greening would open the pathways, enabling movement. A subsequent shift to a drier climate would cause the forest corridors to retreat and fragment, isolating the populations that had used them and allowing their cultures and languages to develop in new and unique directions. The rise and fall of these green bridges didn't just direct traffic, they pulsed to the rhythm of the planet, alternately connecting and separating human communities and driving the incredible diversity we see across Africa today. The legacy of these journeys is not forgotten. It is encoded in the shared words for axe and cattle across a continent, and in the silent, enduring presence of the forests themselves, which guard the secrets of the ancient wanderers who once found their way through the green. Now we journey to a concept that transforms our very understanding of what a corridor can be. We move from physical pathways of earth and ice to something far more ethereal yet equally powerful, a network not carved into the land itself, but sung into existence across it. Across the vast expanse of Australia, indigenous cultures have maintained for millennia a breathtakingly sophisticated system of navigation, history, and law that exists entirely within the realm of story and song. These are the songlines or dreaming tracks, and they represent perhaps the most profound and unique corridors we will ever encounter, pathways woven not from stone, but from spirit, memory, and the very breath of human expression. Imagine a map where every single feature of the landscape is alive with meaning. A particular rock formation isn't just a collection of stones, it is the frozen body of an ancestral creator being from the dream time. A waterhole isn't merely a source of water, it is the place where that being stopped to drink, and its creative energy still resides there. A songline is the epic story of that ancestor's journey across the land during the dreaming, the creative era at the dawn of time. The path they walked, the features they created, the events that happened to them, all of this is encoded in a long, intricate song cycle. To sing the song is to literally retrace the steps of the ancestor, to navigate from one landmark to the next by describing them in verse. The melody and rhythm of the song act as a sonic map, with the lyrics detailing the location of water sources, food plants, sacred sites, and safe resting places. One does not need a physical map when they hold the song in their heart. The land itself becomes the score, and your movement across it is the performance. This turns the entire continent into a vast, interconnected library of knowledge. A person who knows the emu songline, for instance, can travel hundreds of miles across country they have never seen before, guided solely by the sequence of verses. Each verse corresponds to a specific location. When the singer arrives at a new place, the next verse in the cycle will describe what they see, confirming they are on the correct path and instructing them on what to do there, perhaps to collect a certain type of bush food, to approach a water source with respect, or to perform a specific ceremony. This oral mapping system is astonishingly precise. The songs can indicate subtle changes in topography, the types of trees and animals found in an area, and the geological makeup of the soil. It is a holistic navigational system that seamlessly blends practical survival skills with deep spiritual understanding and environmental science. but the songlines are far more than just a wayfinding tool. They are the very bedrock of Aboriginal law, culture, and social structure. These song cycles are not owned by individuals. They are the sacred property of the clans whose traditional lands the songline passes through. Knowledge of the songs is a heavy responsibility, passed down through generations under strict protocols. The songs dictate the relationships between different clans and language groups. If your songline connects to my country, we are linked by that ancestral story, and that connection creates obligations of hospitality, trade, and mutual support. Ceremonial gatherings often involve the performance of these songs, which reinforces these social bonds and ensures the knowledge is passed on correctly. The songlines created a continent-wide network of reciprocity and relationship, where even distant groups were connected through the shared mythology of the land itself, long before the concept of a nation-state ever existed. The endurance of this knowledge system through over 60,000 years of human history stands as a monumental testament to the power of oral tradition. In a world without writing, the songlines were a living, breathing database. The act of walking the land while singing the song was a form of constant data verification. If a feature described in the song had changed, a tree had fallen, a river had shifted course, the song could be subtly adapted to reflect this, ensuring its practical accuracy for the next generation while maintaining the sacred, unchanging core of the ancestral story. This is a dynamic, adaptive form of history, one that is performed and experienced rather than simply read. It demonstrates a way of knowing that is intimately tied to place, a philosophy where knowledge cannot be separated from the landscape that produced it. The land and the song are one and the same. To know one is to know the other. In our modern context, the songlines offer a radical and beautiful alternative perspective on how humans can relate to space and navigate the world. We think of corridors as things we build: roads, railways, tunnels. The songline is a corridor that is perceived, sung, and remembered. It requires no asphalt, no steel, only a deep, respectful, and participatory relationship with the environment. It challenges the very idea of wilderness as an empty space to be conquered and mapped. Instead, it reveals a landscape that is already full of meaning, story, and connection, waiting to be listened to. The songlines remind us that the most enduring pathways are not those we impose upon the world, but those we discover through story, ceremony, and a sacred duty to remember, transforming a simple journey across the earth into a walking prayer that echoes the footsteps of the very first ancestors. Long before the Great Pyramids of Teotihuacan pierced the sky or the Maya city-states flourished in the lowland jungles, the foundations for these civilizations were being laid along a hidden web of footpaths that crisscrossed the Americas. These were the Mesoamerican trade routes, a prehistoric network of astonishing complexity and reach that turned a vast and geographically fragmented landscape into a connected world of exchange. Far from being isolated, the early cultures of Mexico and Central America were engaged in a vibrant, long-distance commerce that moved not just objects, but the very ideas that would define their future. The sheer variety of the goods traveling these routes reveals a sophisticated economic landscape with specialized production centers separated by hundreds of miles. From the highlands of Guatemala came the most prized commodity of all, jade. This vibrant green stone, harder than steel, was more valuable than gold to these cultures, symbolizing water, life, and fertility. Its journey from quarry to ruler was a long one, requiring skilled artisans to shape it into ceremonial axes, elaborate ear spools, and death masks for the elite using only cord, water, and sand. From the volcanic highlands around Pachuca in Mexico came obsidian, the razor-sharp volcanic glass that was the essential cutting tool of the ancient world. This material was a strategic resource, controlled and traded in pre-formed cores that could be flaked into blades, spear points, and ritual knives. And from the humid lowlands of the Yucatan and the Pacific coast came the beans of the cacao tree, which were fermented, roasted, and ground to create chocolate. But cacao was far more than a luxury drink. Its beans were used as a form of currency, a literal unit of value that could be traded for other goods, making it one of the world's first commodity monies. Navigating this network was a feat of human endurance and ingenuity. There were no wheels or pack animals like horses or camels to ease the burden. Everything was carried on the backs of human porters, known in later Aztec times as tilemim. These professional traders would form caravans, moving along established trails that wound through some of the most challenging terrain on the continent. They traversed dense, jaguar-haunted rainforests where the canopy blocked out the sun, climbed treacherous mountain passes into thin, cold air, and paddled sturdy dugout canoes along coastal routes and navigable rivers. Their knowledge of the land was absolute. They knew where to find fresh water, which paths were safest in which season, and how to negotiate passage with the many different communities whose territories they crossed. These routes were not empty highways. They were social spaces, punctuated by trading outposts and neutral ground where goods could be exchanged under agreed-upon rules of conduct, fostering a level of trust that allowed commerce to flourish across cultural boundaries. The true value of this network, however, extended far beyond the physical goods. These routes were the primary conduits for the spread of the technologies and ideologies that would fuel the rise of classic Mesoamerican civilization. The most revolutionary of these was the idea of maize agriculture. The knowledge of how to domesticate and cultivate maize did not simply appear everywhere at once. It almost certainly originated in one region, perhaps the Balsas River Valley of Mexico, and then spread along these trade routes. One community would see the superior maize strains cultivated by their trading partners and adopt the practice themselves. This single innovation allowed for population growth and the settled life that made complex society possible. Similarly, the core religious and cosmological ideas that unified the region, the worship of a feathered serpent deity, a complex calendar system, the ritual ball game, all traveled along these same pathways. A ceremonial ball court discovered in a highland village shows that they were participating in a shared cultural tradition with people in distant lowland cities. The trade routes ensured that a cultural innovation in one area did not remain a local secret but could become a continent-wide revolution. This deep history of interconnection completely shatters the old image of isolated, mysterious cultures rising and falling in solitude. The Olmec, often called Mesoamerica's mother culture, were not an island. Their iconic jade and serpentine carvings were made from rock sourced from hundreds of miles away, proving their reach was immense. The great city of Teotihuacan, centuries later, established formal merchant enclaves in distant Maya cities like Tikal, influencing their art and architecture in profound ways. The Maya themselves, for all their legendary independence, were deeply plugged into this network, relying on trade for essential resources like obsidian and salt. These routes were the veins of a living, breathing continent, and the goods and ideas that flowed through them were the lifeblood that nourished the heart of every great civilization that would ever call this land home. Now let's turn our attention to a precious substance born not from the Earth's fiery heart, but from the quiet, ancient forests that once blanketed northern Europe. Imagine holding a piece of amber golden, warm to the touch, and perhaps cradling a perfectly preserved insect that buzzed among the dinosaurs. This fossilized tree resin, washed up on the shores of the Baltic Sea, became one of the prehistoric world's most sought-after luxuries. so desirable that it inspired one of history's first and longest-running long-distance trade networks, the Baltic Amber Routes. These were not a single road, but a sprawling, evolving web of pathways that stretched for thousands of miles, connecting the foggy, pine-scented coasts of the Baltic all the way to the sun-drenched palaces of the Mediterranean, turning a simple natural object into a catalyst for cross-continental connection. The allure of amber, or northern gold, was multifaceted and powerful. Its visual beauty was undeniable. When polished, it glowed with an internal warmth, capturing the light in a way that no stone could. But its value went far deeper than the aesthetic. In the ancient world, amber was believed to hold potent magical and medicinal properties. Because it generates static electricity when rubbed, it was considered a stone of life and energy. Cultures across Europe and the Near East attributed to it the power to ward off evil spirits, cure ailments from sore throats to madness, and ensure a safe journey into the afterlife. This combination of beauty, mystique, and perceived utility made it an ideal prestige good, a non-essential item that conveyed immense social status. To own and wear amber was to display a connection to distant, mysterious lands and access to a far-reaching trade network. Its worth was not inherent in the material itself, but was created entirely by human desire, a perfect example of value being in the eye of the beholder. The journey of a single piece of amber from its origin on a Baltic beach to its final resting place in a Mycenaean tomb or an Egyptian pharaoh's treasure chest was an epic saga of hand-to-hand exchange. The route was far too long for any single merchant to travel. Instead, it functioned as a complex chain of intermediaries. It likely began with local hunter-gatherer communities who collected the raw resin from the shoreline. They would trade it inland to agrarian societies who saw its value and passed it south. The amber would move through river valleys like the Oder and the Vistula, which acted as natural funnels guiding trade southward. At key points, it would cross the Alps through passes like the Brenner, entering the sphere of the sophisticated Mediterranean world. At each handoff, its value increased as the risk and distance already traveled were factored into its price. This down-the-line trade meant that a Baltic chieftain might be buried with Mediterranean bronze, while a Greek noblewoman might be buried with Baltic amber, neither knowing the full extent of the journey that had brought these treasures to them. The impact of this trade was profound, creating a feedback loop of cultural and technological exchange. The demand for amber in the south meant that northern European societies gained access to goods and technologies they could not produce themselves. In exchange for the golden resin, they received finely crafted bronze weapons, tools, and exquisite jewelry from Central Europe and the Mediterranean. This influx of metal was revolutionary. It introduced new metallurgical skills, altered social hierarchies by creating a new class of wealthy traders, and spurred local innovation. Furthermore, the routes themselves became channels for more than just goods. They carried ideas, artistic styles, and religious beliefs. The motifs on a bronze pin found in Denmark might show influences from Hungarian metalworking styles, which in turn were influenced by Mycenaean Greek art. The Amber Road was a two-way street, and while the physical amber flowed south, a current of cultural influence and innovation flowed north, helping to shape the development of early European societies from the ground up. Evidence of this vast network is etched into the archaeological record with stunning clarity. One of the most famous finds is the tomb of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, who ruled in the 14th century BC. Among his magnificent burial goods was a beautiful carved scarab beetle, expertly authenticated as being made from Baltic amber. This single artifact places a piece of the Nordic coastline directly inside a royal Egyptian tomb, a tangible connection across continents and cultures. Closer to the source, hordes of amber found along the suspected routes, sometimes raw and sometimes worked into local bead styles, mark the locations of ancient trading posts or the caches of wealthy merchants. These silent deposits confirm the route's path and its economic importance, proving that long before the Roman Empire formalized trade with legions and roads, a prehistoric network of footpaths and riverways was already binding Europe together through the quiet, persistent trade of a beautiful, golden stone that had captured the imagination of the entire ancient world. From the icy passes of Beringia to the green corridors of the Sahara, these 29 prehistoric pathways reveal a world far more connected than we often imagine. They show us that human history is a tapestry woven with threads of migration, innovation, and adaptation, driven by the relentless urge to explore and connect. For thousands of years, these secret corridors served as the planet's original social network, long before the invention of writing or the wheel, enabling the exchange of everything that makes us human, from genes and languages to technologies and beliefs. They challenge the simplistic maps we hold in our minds, replacing static continents separated by blue voids with a dynamic vision of land bridges, river highways, and maritime routes that pulsed with life and movement. This hidden geography proves that isolation was often the exception, not the rule, and that our ancestors were master navigators of a world that was constantly changing beneath their feet. Understanding these ancient passageways does more than just enrich our knowledge of the past. It fundamentally reshapes our sense of identity and belonging. Every time we uncover a new piece of this puzzle, a submerged settlement, a genetic link, a tool style shared across oceans, we are reminded of a profound and shared humanity. The story of our species is not one of separate peoples developing in isolation, but a single, sprawling narrative of interconnection. The courage that propelled a group across the frozen expanse of Beringia is the same spirit that guided sailors along the Kelp highway. The ingenuity that allowed communities to thrive in the Green Sahara is the same innovative drive that built the trading networks of Mesoamerica. These corridors underscore a universal truth that curiosity and resilience are the defining traits of humanity, qualities that allowed us to populate every corner of the globe against impossible odds. As technology advances, we continue to piece together this grand story with tools our ancestors could never have dreamed of. Genetic sequencing allows us to trace migration routes through DNA, revealing journeys encoded in our very cells. LiDAR technology peels back the forest canopy to expose lost cities and roads, while underwater archaeology brings sunken landscapes back to life. Each discovery is a humbling reminder that history is not a closed book but an ongoing excavation, filled with surprises that constantly challenge what we thought we knew. The search for these hidden corridors is more than an academic pursuit. It is a quest to understand our collective past and to appreciate the incredible adaptability that allowed humanity to not just survive, but to flourish, turning entire continents into a canvas for our shared journey. Thank you for joining this incredible journey through time and across continents. If this exploration of our deep, interconnected past resonated with you, please let us know in the comments below. We love hearing your thoughts and theories. If you enjoyed this video, a like and a subscription to the channel would mean the world to us, as it helps bring these hidden histories to more people. Until next time, keep exploring.